Welcome, dear listener. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Truly, whether you've just closed your eyes after a long day, or you're tucked beneath a warm blanket with the world outside, still and distant, I want you to know this moment was made for you. Not for rushing, not for thinking, not for remembering what you forgot to do, just for being here, for letting go, for allowing yourself to be carried gently into a story that doesn't demand your attention, but simply offers you a place to rest. And if you've ever found comfort in the quiet corners of history, the ones where the grand events fade into the background, and what remains are the soft sounds of a family breathing in the dark, a child's laugh muffled by pillows, a mother's hand smoothing the sheets one last time before sleep, then this story is for you. It's about the Romanovs, not as they appear in textbooks or grainy black and white photographs, stiff with ceremony and burdened by crowns, not as villains or martyrs, not as symbols of a fallen empire, but as people, as a family who lived, loved, feared, and dreamed just like we do. Now, before we begin, I should tell you something. This won't be like the stories you may have heard, the ones wrapped in mystery and melodrama, where Anastasia miraculously survives and dances through Paris with a locket full of diamonds and a memory full of snow. Though if she did, I hope she at least found a good pastry shop. One can survive a revolution, but surviving a bad croissant? That's true tragedy. No, tonight we won't chase legends. We won't dramatize the final moments with thunder or music swelling. Instead, we'll walk slowly through the halls of their lives, where the air still carries the scent of beeswax and old books, where the floorboards creak not from age, but from memory. This is not a tale of power. It's a tale of presence, of a father who wanted to be kind, a mother who prayed too much and smiled too little, children who played games in the palace corridors, drawing maps of imaginary kingdoms, unaware that their own world was already beginning to dissolve. It's about winter-long, relentless, beautiful winter, and a family who lived through it, not knowing that the thaw would never come for them. And if this kind of story moves you, if you find peace in the quiet echoes of lives long gone, in the way history breathes when no one is rushing to tell it, then I'd love for you to stay with us. If you haven't already, consider subscribing. Leave a comment if you feel like it's just your name or where you're listening from tonight. A city, a country, a window facing the moon. It doesn't change the past, but it reminds me that someone is here, listening, and that makes all the difference. Now let your breath slow. Let your body sink deeper into stillness. Imagine the air around you growing just a little colder, not harsh, not sharp, but clean, like the first breath of night in a northern land. A kind of cold that makes your cheeks flush and your thoughts grow quiet. Above you, the sky is vast and deep, scattered with stars so bright they seem to tremble. Snow falls without hurry, each flake turning in the dark before landing on the frozen streets of St. Petersburg, where the gas lamps glow like drowned suns beneath a veil of frost. And there, rising from the silence, stands the Winter Palace. Not as a monument, not as a fortress of power, but as a home. Its golden domes were caps of snow. Its windows shine with a soft, buttery light, like candles left burning for someone expected home. Inside, the air is still. The clocks tick softly. A dog barks once, far off, in a private wing. Somewhere, a door clicks shut. The palace is alive, not with grandeur, but with the quiet pulse of daily life, of tea poured at the same hour, of letters folded and sealed, of children whispering under blankets long after they were meant to be asleep. This is where we begin, not with revolution, not with gunfire, not with the end, but with the moment before the storm, when everything still feels ordinary, when a father reads to his son, when a mother watches her daughters from the doorway, when the world, for just one more night, holds its breath and pretends it won't have to let go. So close your eyes now, if you haven't already. Let the cold air fill your lungs. Let the silence grow around you, deep and tender. And let me take you, step by quiet step, into the last winter of the Romanovs. Long before the world began to tremble beneath the weight of change, before the whispers in the streets grew into voices too loud to ignore, Russia was a land shaped not by speed or urgency, but by the deep, unbroken rhythm of seasons that turned like the pages of an ancient book read in silence. It was a country where time did not race forward, but settled into the earth like frost at dawn, where the horizon stretched so far in every direction that it seemed to dissolve into the sky itself, and where the silence between one breath and the next was not empty, but full of presence of wind through birch trees, of distant church bells carried on the cold, of footsteps muffled by snow that had lain undisturbed for weeks. This was a realm where life unfolded slowly, where the same paths were walked by generations, where the same prayers were whispered in the same wooden churches, and where the idea of tomorrow was not something to be seized, but something to be endured, like winter. The villages were small, scattered like forgotten thoughts across the endless steppe, their wooden houses built close together as if for warmth, their roofs bowed under the weight of years of snow, their windows glowing faintly at dusk like the eyes of sleeping animals. Smoke curled from crooked chimneys in thin, wavering lines, carrying with it the scent of burning birch logs, of onions frying in lard, of damp wool drying near stoves, and of the sourdough bread that rose slowly in clay pots beside the hearth. Inside, families gathered in the single warm room, their faces lit by the flicker of oil lamps or the red glow of the pechka, the Russian stove that stood like a small temple at the heart of the home, radiating heat through the long night. Children sat on the floor with bare feet tucked beneath them, listening to their elders speak in low voices of saints and spirits, of wolves that could speak, of tsars who once walked among the people in disguise to test their kindness, their words forming a tapestry of myth and memory that wrapped around them like a second skin. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and old books, of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, of the faint musk of animals sheltered just beyond the back wall. And when the wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and shaking the very foundations, no one startled. They only leaned closer to the fire, pulled their shawls tighter, and waited for the storm to pass, as their parents had, and their parents before them. In the cities, life moved with a different rhythm, though still wrapped in a kind of slowness that felt eternal, as if the past and present were not separate, but woven together like threads in a tapestry too old to unravel. Moscow stirred beneath the golden domes of churches that shimmered in the morning light like flames frozen in time, their crosses catching the sun and scattering it in shards across the cobbled streets below. The bells of the Kremlin did not ring on the hour, nor by the command of a clock, but when they were needed calling the faithful to prayer at dawn, marking the passing of a soul at dusk, announcing the arrival of a holy day with a slow, solemn toll that rolled over the city like a wave through still water. Markets buzzed with color and scent, not in the frantic way of modern bazaars, but with a steady, unhurried pulse, as if everyone had all the time in the world. Vendors stood behind wooden stalls piled high, with wheels of yellow cheese wrapped in coarse cloth, bundles of dried mushrooms tied with twine, jars of honey so dark it looked like liquid amber pulled from the earth, and baskets of rye bread still warm from the oven, its crust crackling as it cooled. They called out in low, steady voices, not to attract attention, but as a kind of ritual more habit than hope, while customers wrapped in heavy coats and fur hats pulled low browsed slowly, touching the bread, sniffing the herbs, bargaining in quiet tones that rose and fell like a conversation between old friends. Somewhere nearby, a balalaika played a single mournful tune, its notes drifting through the air like smoke, and children ran between the stalls, their laughter sharp and bright against the gray sky, their boots kicking up small clouds of frozen dust. And far to the north, in the heart of it all, St. Petersburg stood like a dream built on water and will, a city that had been carved from marshland by the command of a man who believed he could shape nature itself. Peter the Great had willed it into existence, dragging stone and timber from across the empire, conscripting thousands of laborers to drain the swamps and lay the foundations, many of whom died in the process, their bones said to lie beneath the very streets they helped to build. Now, in the early years of the 20th century, it wore its grandeur with a kind of weary elegance, its facades painted in soft blues and pale yellows, their ornate carvings worn smooth by wind and time, their balconies draped in iron lace that glistened with frost in the winter light. The city was a place of contrasts of wide, imperial avenues lined with statues that watched the world with stone eyes, and narrow alleyways where the poor lived in cramped apartments with no heat and little light, of glittering palaces that reflected the Neva River like mirrors, and frozen canals where washerwomen broke through the ice to scrub clothes by hand. In summer, the white nights stretched the daylight into a haze where shadows never fully formed, and people walked the embankments until 2 in the morning as if the sun would never truly set. In winter, the Neva froze solid, and the river became a road, crossed by sleds pulled by horses with breath like steam, by merchants hauling goods on wooden skates, by couples walking arm in arm beneath the gas lamps that flickered like drowned stars. The air was sharp with cold, but also with life, the sound of laughter, of bells, of distant music from a ballroom where the elite danced while the rest of the city shivered in the dark. The imperial family lived at the center of this world, not as distant gods, but as figures woven into the fabric of the nation's identity, their image printed on coins, their portraits hung in schools and train stations, their names spoken with a mixture of reverence and resignation. For more than 3 centuries, the Romanovs had ruled, their lineage stretching back to a time when muskets were new, and the world beyond the forest was still unknown, when the Tsar was not only a ruler, but a father to his people, a living link between heaven and earth. Their reign had seen empires rise and fall, wars fought and forgotten, lands gained and lost, and yet they remained constant, unchanging, as much a part of Russia as the snow, the silence, the long, dark nights that seemed to go on forever. They were not loved by all, nor were they untouched by scandal or sorrow, but they were there, a fixed point in a world that rarely moved fast. And so, when Nikolai Alexandrovich ascended the throne, it was not with fanfare or revolution, but with the quiet acceptance of a nation that had seen this before, that expected little and hoped for less. He was not a man of grand gestures or fiery speeches, not a conqueror or a visionary, but a man who preferred the company of his family to the weight of ceremony, who walked the palace gardens in simple boots, even in winter, when the paths were dusted with snow and the trees stood bare like skeletons against the sky. He loved the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace was still, when the only sound was the creak of floorboards and the distant hum of a servant lighting a stove. He wore his uniforms with care, each button polished, each ribbon placed just so, not out of vanity, but because he believed that dignity lay in detail, that respect was shown not in words, but in the way one carried oneself. He was not blind to the world beyond the palace. He read the reports, he listened to his advisers, but he believed deeply and sincerely. That order was maintained not by force, but by tradition, that the old ways, if followed with honesty and faith, would carry Russia forward without rupture, as they had for generations. His wife, Alexandra Fyodorovna, was a woman shaped by devotion and sorrow, by a love so deep it bordered on fear. Born a German princess, she had come to Russia as a bride full of hope, only to find herself adrift in a court that watched her closely, judged her silently, resented her accent, her reserve, her refusal to play the role of the glittering empress. She spoke Russian with care, but never quite without a trace of foreignness, and that small difference was enough for some to see her as an outsider, as someone who did not truly belong. She withdrew into faith, into prayer, into the private world of her children, where she could be more than a symbol, more than a figurehead. She was not warm in public, not quick to smile, not eager to charm qualities that made her unpopular in the salons of the aristocracy, but in the safety of her family's presence, she softened, her voice lowering to a murmur, her hands gentle, as she smoothed her youngest son's hair or tucked a blanket around his shoulders. She carried grief like a second shadow, the loss of a daughter in infancy, the constant terror that her only son might not survive the night, the knowledge that every joy was fragile, every moment borrowed. And so she prayed not once, not twice, but endlessly, her lips moving in silence even as she sat at dinner, her fingers tracing the beads of her rosary beneath the table, her eyes distant, as if already speaking to a God who had not yet answered. Their children were not raised as future rulers in the way one might expect, not drilled in statecraft from dawn or forced to stand for hours in stiff uniforms before crowds. Instead, they grew up in a world of routines and affection, of quiet mornings and candlelit evenings, where the greatest drama was a stolen cookie or a snowball fight in the palace courtyard. Olga, the eldest, was thoughtful beyond her years, already writing in her diary with a seriousness that made her seem older, her handwriting neat, her entries filled with observations about the weather, her lessons, her dreams. Tatiana was gentle, with a quiet strength that made others turn to her when they were afraid, when they needed someone to listen without judgment. Maria was warm, open, the one who hugged without hesitation, who laughed easily, who brought flowers from the garden just to make someone smile. Anastasia, the youngest, was bright, mischievous, always ready with a joke or a prank drawing mustaches on photographs, hiding her father's pipe, whispering silly stories to her brother Alexei when he was in pain. And then there was Alexei, the only son, a future Tsar, the boy whose fate was tied not to his mind or his heart, but to the blood that flowed through his veins. Hemophilia ran in his family like a curse, passed down through generations, and even the smallest fall could send him into days of agony, lying still in bed, his legs wrapped in bandages, his breath shallow, his body trembling with pain. His parents watched him with a love so fierce it bordered on desperation. They tried everything: doctors from Paris, specialists from Vienna, prayers in every church, but nothing worked as mysteriously as the presence of a wandering monk named Rasputin, whose voice, whose touch, whose very silence seemed to calm the boy in ways medicine could not explain. They did not understand it. They only knew that when he was near, Alexei slept. Life in the Winter Palace was not one of constant luxury, but of rhythm and ritual, of small moments that repeated like a lullaby. Mornings began with tea served on silver trays, the clink of porcelain, a quiet music in the long corridors, the scent of bergamot and honey rising in soft curls from the cups. The children's lessons were held in a sunlit room where maps of the empire hung on the walls, though the world beyond Russia was rarely discussed, as if everything else were just noise. Afternoons were for walks in the palace gardens, for drawing, for playing with their dogs, Jolly, clumsy animals who followed them like shadows, barking at nothing, rolling in the snow. Evenings brought dinner as a family, simple by imperial standards, bowls of steaming borscht, plates of pirozhiki fresh from the oven, thick slices of black bread with butter that melted into golden pools. Candles were lit, stories were read, prayers were said, and when the children were finally in bed, their parents would linger in the hallway, listening to their breathing, watching the rise and fall of their chests, grateful for another night, without fever, without bleeding, without fear. Outside the palace walls, the empire stretched in every direction east into lands where the sun rose long before St. Petersburg woke, south into deserts and mountains where tribes still lived as they had for centuries, north into tundra where the wind never stopped howling and the nights lasted for months. It was a realm so vast that a letter could take weeks to cross it, where some villages had never seen a train, and others spoke languages no one in the capital could understand. And yet, all of it answered to one name. All of it belonged to one family. That was the belief, at least. That was the story told in schools, in churches, in the quiet moments when parents tucked their children in and said, "Sleep well, the Tsar watches over us." The people, for the most part, believed it too, not blindly, but with a kind of weary faith, the kind that comes not from joy, but from endurance. They did not expect miracles. They did not dream of palaces. They asked only for enough bread, for fair weather, for their children to survive the winter. And when the Tsar appeared in public, riding in his carriage through the city, they bowed not out of fear, but out of habit, of respect, of the deep-rooted idea that the world was as it had always been, and therefore would always be. The seasons turned, the snow fell, the rivers froze and thawed, the bells rang. Life went on. There were signs, of course, small things. A factory worker who stopped bowing. A student caught reading a forbidden book. A priest who spoke too openly about justice. But these were like leaves caught in the wind, noticed, perhaps, but not seen as storms. The world still felt solid. The palace still stood. The family still gathered for dinner. The children still laughed in the corridors. The dogs still barked at nothing. The candles still burned. And so, in those final years before everything changed, Russia existed in a kind of suspended peace, a breath held, a pause between heartbeats, a moment so quiet that no one noticed how fragile it truly was. The snow fell gently on the roofs of the villages, on the domes of the churches, on the frozen surface of the Neva. The stars blinked above the winter palace, indifferent, eternal. And inside, a mother tucked her youngest child into bed, smoothed his hair, kissed his forehead, and whispered a prayer that he would wake without pain. It was just another night, just another winter, just another moment in a story that had been going on for centuries. And no one yet knew it was the last time things would feel this way. There was a quiet hum beneath the surface of things, not loud enough to wake anyone from sleep, but present all the same a vibration in the air, like the distant roll of thunder before a storm that never seems to arrive. It was the yearning of a world beginning to shift, not with explosions or declarations, but with the slow turning of gears too long left still, with the rustle of newspapers passed from hand to hand in dimly lit rooms, with the murmur of voices in factories where men stood for 12 hours at a time, their hands blackened by oil, their lungs thick with dust, wondering aloud why the palaces gleamed while their children went barefoot through snow. Russia was no longer just a land of villages in silence. It was becoming something else, something restless, something uncertain, and though the winter palace remained untouched by the wind of change, its windows sealed against the cold, its corridors lit by the same golden glow as always, the echoes of that growing unease slipped through the cracks, like drafts beneath a door no one had thought to close. It was not a single voice, not one protest, not one event, but 1,000 small tremors, each one barely felt on its own, yet together forming a current that could no longer be ignored, a tide rising so slowly that even those who stood in its path did not notice the water climbing their ankles. Nikolai still walked the gardens each morning, his boots pressing into the frost, his breath rising in soft clouds as he paused to watch a bird land on a frozen branch. Alexandra still lit her candles before the icons, her lips moving in silent prayer, her fingers tracing the outline of the cross, as if trying to hold on to something solid in a world that felt increasingly fragile. The children still played their games, still wrote in their diaries, still laughed when Anastasia hit a rubber frog in Maria's bed, or when Alexei, on one of his better days, managed to limp down the hall fast enough to catch them. But even within the warmth of their private world, there were moments small, almost imperceptible, when the stillness broke. A telegram arrived earlier than expected, its envelope sealed with urgency. A servant hesitated before entering the dining room, as if unsure whether to deliver news best left for later. The radio, still a rare and curious device in most homes, crackled with reports from the front, voices speaking of shortages, of unrest, of soldiers who no longer obeyed orders without question. And then there were the letters, anonymous ones, sometimes crumpled, sometimes carefully folded, that made their way into the palace, slipped into coat pockets, or left on benches in the garden. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply asked, "How long will you sleep while we freeze? How long will you feast while we starve?" It was not hatred that carried these words, not at first, but exhaustion, a weariness so deep it had begun to take the shape of doubt. For centuries, the people had accepted their place, believing that the Tsar ruled by divine right, that he was chosen by God to guide them, to suffer with them, to pray for them. But now, some began to wonder. If he truly suffered with them, why did he not see them? If he prayed, why did nothing change? The war had been meant to unite the nation, to stir pride in the heart of every Russian, but instead it had exposed the cracks in the empire's foundation. Men were sent to die in trenches with no bullets, with boots that fell apart in the mud, with coats too thin to keep out the cold. Wives wrote to the capital, begging for news of husbands who had vanished into the fog of battle. Mothers stood in line for bread that never came. And still, the palace remained a world apart, wrapped in ritual, in tradition, in the quiet belief that things would settle, that order would return, that the storm would pass if they just held on a little longer. The disconnect was not born of cruelty, but of distance of a life lived behind velvet curtains, where the wind outside sounded like music, not warning. It was in this atmosphere that Grigory Rasputin moved, not as a force of chaos, but as a shadow that had found its way into the light. He was not a courtier, not a general, not a man of titles or land, but a peasant from the far east of Siberia, a wanderer with long, tangled hair and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. He had walked for years across the vastness of Russia, sleeping in barns, praying in village churches, drinking tea with shepherds and monks, absorbing the rhythms of the land and the voices of the forgotten. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice was low, steady, almost hypnotic, as if each word had been weighed before it was released, as if silence were the truest form of speech. He had come to the capital not to seize power, but to offer healing to the Tsarevich, to the Empress, to the soul of a family that lived in constant fear. And though the aristocracy recoiled at his presence, though they whispered of drunkenness and scandal, though they mocked his rough hands and his unshaven face, they could not deny what happened when he entered the boy's room. Alexei would calm, his breathing would slow, the pain would recede, as if the very air changed when Rasputin laid his hands upon him. The doctors could not explain it. The priests debated whether it was a miracle or a deception. But Alexandra believed deeply, absolutely, that he was a man sent by God, a starets, a holy fool, one of those rare souls who walked between worlds, who could speak to the divine in a language no church had taught. And so, despite the protests, despite the rumors that spread like frost across glass, he remained. He came and went as he pleased, sometimes disappearing for weeks, only to return with dirt on his boots and a quiet certainty in his gaze. He sat at the edge of the royal circle, not as an equal, but as something stranger, a guest, a guardian, a presence that could not be categorized. The children were wary of him at first, unnerved by the way he looked at them, as if he could see their thoughts. But over time, they grew used to his silence, to the way he sometimes smiled without showing his teeth, to the way he would hum an old folk tune under his breath. Even Nikolai, who distrusted mysticism and preferred the order of protocol, could not bring himself to send him away, not when his wife's eyes lit up at the mere mention of his name, not when his son's suffering eased in his presence. And yet, there was something unsettling in the way power began to shift, not through decrees or battles, but through late-night conversations in candlelit rooms, through letters written in Alexandra's hand that bore Rasputin's influence, through appointments made not by ministers, but by a man who claimed to hear the voice of God in his dreams. The courtiers watched from the edges, their smiles tight, their bows too deep, their conversations turning sharp the moment he left the room. Outside the palace, the city listened, not with reverence, but with growing suspicion. Cartoons appeared in underground papers, crude drawings of Rasputin with horns, of the empress kneeling before him, of the Tsar blindfolded while the monk pulled the strings of the empire. Soldiers muttered in the barracks. Students gathered in basements to read the works of Marx and Lenin, their voices rising with each sentence, their hands clenched around books that spoke of a world without kings, without palaces, without bloodlines. And still, the seasons turned. The snow fell. The Neva froze. The bells rang. Life went on. But the air was different now, thicker, charged. It was the feeling you get just before lightning strikes, a sense that something is coming, not because you see it, but because your skin knows it, because the silence has grown too loud. In the factories, men stopped praying and started organizing. In the villages, elders no longer told stories of the kind Tsar, but of the one who had forgotten them. In the schools, children were taught to recite the names of their rulers, but some whispered other names instead: Lenin, Trotsky, Revolution. And in the Winter Palace, as the lamps were lit and the family gathered for dinner, as the dogs barked in the distance and the wind tapped at the windows like a visitor who knew it would soon be let in, no one spoke of what was coming. No one dared, because to name it would be to admit that the world they knew was ending. And so they remained silent. And the whispers grew louder. In the winter of 1913, the Romanovs celebrated 300 years of their dynasty with a grand ceremony in Moscow, a spectacle of gold and incense, of processions through snow-covered streets, of bells ringing across the frozen city. The Tsar and Tsarista stood on a balcony draped in crimson, their children beside them, waving to a crowd that stretched as far as the eye could see. People wept. They threw flowers. They believed, in that moment, that the empire was eternal, that the family was blessed, that the future would be a continuation of the past. But even then, in the midst of the celebration, there were those who did not cheer. Workers stood at the edges of the square, their faces blank, their hands in their pockets. A young man in a warm coat turned to his friend and said, "They think this means something, but the world doesn't care about anniversaries." And he was right. The celebration was not a renewal, but a farewell in disguise, a final bow before the curtain fell. The people wanted bread. They wanted peace. They wanted to be seen. And instead, they were given pageantry, a performance of power that felt more like a plea than a declaration. Back in St. Petersburg, life in the palace continued as if nothing had changed. The children played charades in the evening, their laughter echoing through the long halls. Alexei sat on a sofa, wrapped in a blanket, his face pale but smiling, as his sisters acted out a scene from a play they had written. Alexandra watched from the doorway, her hands folded, her prayer book in her pocket. Nikolai read a report on military supplies, his pen moving slowly across the page, his mind elsewhere. And yet the weight of the empire pressed on him, not as a crown, but as a silence made of unanswered letters, of ministers who avoided his gaze, of newspapers that no longer praised him, but questioned. He did not rage. He did not weep. He simply carried it, like a man walking through deep snow, each step heavier than the last. He believed in duty. He believed in God. He believed that if he did the right thing every day, then the storm would pass. But belief, no matter how sincere, cannot stop the tide. Rasputin, in the meantime, became more visible, more controversial. He was seen in restaurants with women whose names were not supposed to be spoken in polite company. He drank heavily, laughed loudly, spoke in riddles that only he understood. The court used these moments to paint him as a fraud, a charlatan, a man who had tricked the empress with false miracles. But those who watched him closely noticed something else. When he was alone, when no one was looking, he would stop laughing. His face would grow still. He would stare into the distance, as if listening to something no one else could hear. And sometimes he would say things quietly, to no one in particular, that later came true. He warned that war would bring ruin. He said that Tsar would lose his throne. He spoke of blood in the snow. No one listened. They called it madness. But madness, in a world that refuses to see, is often the only form of clarity. The war dragged on, and with it, the empire began to unravel. Trains that once carried grain now carried coffins. Factories that made tools now made shells. Children played war games in the streets, reenacting battles they did not understand. And still, the palace remained a sanctuary of routine lessons, walks, prayers, meals, while outside, the world burned slowly, quietly, without spectacle. The disconnect was not malice. It was blindness. A kind of sleepwalking through history, as if the past could protect them from the future. But the future was already here. It stood in the lines of women waiting for bread. It whispered in the meetings of revolutionaries in smoke-filled rooms. It breathed in the silence between the Tsar's decisions and the people's hunger. Alexandra, more than anyone, felt the walls closing in. She trusted no one but Rasputin. She wrote to him constantly, her letters filled with fear, with love for her children, with despair over her husband's indecision. She believed he was the only one who could save them, who could save Alexei, who could save Russia. And in her isolation, her power grew not through politics, but through influence. She urged Nikolai to dismiss ministers, to delay elections, to trust only those who supported the old ways. Her letters were read, copied, leaked. The court called her the Juran woman, the spy, the puppet of a mad monk. But she did not care. She was not playing politics. She was fighting for her son's life. Nikolai, caught between his duty and his love, between the world he ruled and the family he cherished, grew quieter, more withdrawn. He walked the gardens longer. He spoke less at dinner. He stared at maps of the front lines as if they might reveal a solution. He received reports of mutinies, of strikes, of villages burning, and he signed orders with a hand that trembled only slightly. He was not weak. He was not cruel. He was a man trapped in a role too large for any one person, a man who wanted to be good, but did not know how to be great. And in that gap, between intention and action, between love and leadership, the empire began to slip away. The winter of 1916 was the coldest in memory. The Neva froze so thick that people walked across it as if it were a road. The gas lamps flickered under layers of ice. The palace, for all its warmth, felt like a tomb wrapped in velvet. And in December, the unthinkable happened. A group of nobles, desperate to rid themselves of Rasputin's influence, lured him to a palace on the outskirts of the city. They fed him poisoned cakes and shot him. When he did not die, they beat him, bound him, and threw his body into the icy Neva. The news spread slowly, like a rumor too dark to be true. When Alexandra heard, she collapsed. Nikolai wept. The children were told he had gone away, but everyone knew. And in that moment, something broke, not just in the family, but in the fabric of belief that had held the empire together. If a man who claimed to speak to God could be murdered in the heart of the capital, then what protection remained for the Tsar? And yet, even in death, Rasputin haunted them. His predictions echoed in the silence. The war worsened. The people grew angrier. The snow kept falling, covering the city in a shroud of white, as if the earth itself were mourning. The children still played. The dogs still barked. The candles still burned. But the air was thinner now, the light dimmer, the dreams shorter. The world was holding its breath, waiting, listening, because the first cracks had appeared. The whispers had become voices. And the long winter was no longer just a season, it was a warning. There came a moment, not marked by thunder or the clash of arms, but by the quiet turning of a page in a diary, the soft closing of a palace door, the barely perceptible shift in the way a father looked at his son, when the path ahead could no longer be avoided. It was not a single decision, not a decree signed in haste, but a series of small choices, each one made in the dim light of candlelit rooms, each one carrying the weight of a world that had begun to tremble beneath the surface. Nikolai had always believed that leadership was not in grand gestures, but in the daily act of showing up, of doing what was right, of honoring the duty passed down through generations. And so, when the war dragged on and the reports from the front grew darker, when the factories fell silent for lack of coal and the bread lines in Petrograd stretched around entire blocks, he did not rage or retreat. He simply stood a little taller, walked a little slower, and began to make decisions not as a man who ruled by divine right, but as one who felt the earth shifting beneath his feet. He went to the front, not as a general draped in medals, not to give speeches or inspect troops with fanfare, but to walk among the soldiers, to look into their eyes, to feel the cold mud beneath his boots, to hear the silence between the shells. He wore the uniform of a commander, but carried himself like a father visiting a sick child. He spoke little, asked many questions, and listened, truly listened, to men who had not been heard in years. He saw the frostbitten fingers, the hollow cheeks, the way a young soldier flinched at the sound of a slamming door. He saw the loyalty still there, not to the empire, perhaps, but to the idea of him, to the Tsar who had come, against all advice, to stand in the snow with them. And when he returned to the palace, he was not the same. His shoulders carried a new weight. His voice, when he spoke to his ministers, was firmer, more insistent. He dismissed generals who had lied about victories. He demanded reports in plain language, not in the polished phrases meant to soothe. He began to understand at last that the war was not just a storm to be weathered, but a mirror held up to the soul of Russia, and what it showed him was a nation breaking under the strain. At home, Alexandra watched him change. She saw the lines deepen around his eyes, the way he paused longer before answering even the simplest question, as if every word now carried consequence. She did not speak against his decisions, not openly, but in the quiet hours before sleep, when the house was still and the children were long in bed, she would lay a hand on his arm and whisper, "Are you sure?" Not out of doubt, but out of fear, the fear of a woman who had already lost so much, who knew how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could vanish. And Nikolai would nod, not because he was certain, but because certainty was no longer possible. All he had was duty. All he could do was choose and then live with the choice. And so he chose to stay at the front longer than anyone expected, to take personal command, not because he believed he could win the war, but because he could no longer bear to rule from a distance. Meanwhile, the children grew older, not in the sudden way of stories, but slowly, like trees stretching toward light. Olga, once the shy eldest, began to write with a sharper pen. Her diary entries no longer just about the weather or her lessons, but about the women she saw in the streets, their faces gaunt, their hands cracked from cold water. She asked her tutors about politics, about history, about why some people had so much while others had nothing. Tatiana, always the caretaker, started helping in a small clinic set up near the palace gates, wrapping bandages for wounded soldiers who passed through the city. Maria, with her open heart, wrote letters to families who had lost sons, signing them not as a Grand Duchess, but as a friend. And Anastasia, whose laughter had once filled every room she entered, began to notice the silences, the way her parents exchanged glances when the radio crackled with bad news, the way Alexei sometimes stared out the window as if listening to something no one else could hear. Alexei himself was changing. Not in body, he still bore the marks of his illness, still spent days in bed when the bleeding came, but in spirit. He was no longer just a fragile boy who needed protection. He was beginning to understand his place, not as a future Tsar, but as a witness. He asked questions about the war, about the people, about why God let bad things happen. He read books about sailors and explorers, tracing the routes of ships across vast oceans with his finger, dreaming of a life where he could move freely, where the wind would not feel like a threat. And when he was strong enough, he walked with his father in the garden, leaning on his arm, speaking in a voice that was still soft, but no longer afraid. The war changed everything, not all at once, but like frost creeping across a window pane, slow, silent, inevitable. Factories that once made carriages now produced ambulances. Schools became temporary hospitals. The grand ballrooms of the aristocracy were emptied of chandeliers and filled with rows of cots. Even the Romanovs' private trains, once used for imperial tours, were repurposed to carry wounded soldiers from the front. The world inside the palace began to shrink, not in space, but in luxury. The meals grew simpler. The lights were dimmed. The servants, many of whom had sons at the front, moved through the halls with a new gravity, their laughter rarer, their steps heavier. And still, the family tried to keep the rhythm of their lives' lessons, walks, prayers, stories at night, but the rhythm had changed, like a song played in a lower key. Then came the winter of 1916, a season so cold that even the wolves stayed near the villages, their eyes glowing in the dark. The Neva froze thick enough to walk across, and people did carrying firewood, carrying news, carrying hope. But the cold was not just outside. It seeped into the palace, into the hearts of those who lived there. Letters arrived from distant provinces, reports of starvation, of frozen crops, of children dying in the night. The radio brought word of mutinies, of soldiers refusing to fight, of entire regiments turning their guns on their officers. And Nikolai, back at headquarters, felt the ground slipping beneath him. He issued orders. He made promises. He believed, still, that order could be restored. But belief is not command, and command is not control. It was in this atmosphere that the first real crack appeared. A minister resigned, not with drama, but with quiet dignity, handing in his papers and saying only, "I can no longer serve a government that does not see its people." Then another followed, and another. The Duma, the imperial parliament, began to speak with a voice that was no longer deferential, but firm. They called for reforms, for peace, for a government that answered to the nation, not just the throne. And when Nikolai returned to Petrograd, expecting loyalty, he was met not with celebration, but with silence. The streets were empty. The windows of the ministries were dark. Even the guards at the palace seemed to stand a little straighter, their eyes not quite meeting his. He tried to respond. He made small concessions, new ministers, promises of investigation, pledges to end the war. But the gestures felt hollow, like offerings made too late. The people did not want promises. They wanted bread. They wanted peace. They wanted to be seen. And the longer they waited, the angrier they grew. Women, who had borne the weight of the war in ways no one had acknowledged, began to gather not in protest, at first, but in desperation. They stood in line for hours, only to be told the bread was gone. They walked home with empty baskets, their children crying, their husbands at the front, their bodies worn thin by cold and hunger. And then, one day, they stopped walking home. They turned, and they started walking toward the center of the city. The first march was small. Just a few women, and a few more, then a crowd. They carried no weapons. They shouted no slogans. They simply walked, their boots crunching on the ice, their breath rising in clouds, their voices low but steady. They passed factories, and workers came out to join them. They passed barracks, and soldiers hesitated, then lowered their rifles. They passed churches, and priests rang the bells, not for prayer, but for witness. And as they moved through the city, the snow began to fall, not heavily, but steadily, as if the sky itself were covering their footsteps, protecting them from what was to come. Inside the palace, the family felt it, not through reports, not through telegrams, but through the silence. The usual sounds of the city, the carts, the voices, the distant music had gone. In their place was something else, a stillness so deep it felt like listening. Alexandra lit more candles before the icons. The children stayed close to their mother. Alexei, lying in bed, asked if the snow would stop soon. And Nikolai, standing at the window, watched the flakes fall over the frozen Neva, knowing at last that the world he had tried to preserve was no longer his to command. He made one final decision, not to send troops, not to declare martial law, not to flee. He chose to abdicate, not in anger, not in fear, but in sorrow. He signed the papers in a quiet room, his hand steady, his face calm. He did it not for himself, but for his son, for Alexei, who would never rule, who would never bear the weight of a crown that had become a curse. He gave up the throne not to save the empire, but to save his family. And when it was done, he walked to his son's room, sat beside the bed, and held his hand through the long night. The next morning, the snow still fell. The city remained still, and the palace, once the heart of an empire, stood silent, no longer a seat of power, but a home, waiting for what would come next. There were no crowds at the gates, no salutes, no music, just the soft creak of floorboards as servants moved through the halls, unsure of their place now, unsure of what came after. The children gathered in the sitting room, wrapped in blankets, playing a quiet game of cards, their laughter subdued, as if they sensed that the rules of the world had changed without anyone telling them. Alexandra sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, her rosary untouched for the first time in years. She did not pray. She did not cry. She simply watched the snow fall, as if waiting for someone to come and explain what had just happened. Nikolai did not return to his study. He remained in Alexei's room, holding his son's hand, feeling the faint pulse beneath the skin, the warmth of a life that still breathed, still fought. He thought of the weight he had carried for 23 years, of the ceremonies, the portraits, the endless expectations. And now it was gone, not taken by force, not overthrown by violence, but released like a breath held too long. He did not feel relief. He did not feel regret. He felt emptiness, vast and quiet, like the space between stars. And yet, beneath it, something else, a fragile sense of peace. For the first time in years, he was not the Tsar. He was just a father, just a man. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of freedom he had never known. The days that followed moved like dreams. There were no grand announcements, no formal farewells. The ministers came and went, speaking in hushed tones. The guards changed uniforms. The imperial insignia were removed from the walls, folded away, stored in wooden chests. The family was told they would remain in the palace for now, but no one knew for how long. The children continued their lessons, though the tutors spoke less of history and more of language, of music, of things that might be useful in an unknown future. Anastasia tried to joke, to make them laugh, but her voice cracked when she saw her mother staring at the wall, lost in thought. Olga wrote in her diary every night, not just observations, but fears, questions, fragments of prayers. Tatiana lit a candle each evening, not for God, but for the memory of the life they had lost. And still the snow fell. Day after day, it covered the city, erasing footprints, softening edges, turning the world into a place of muffled sound and softened light. It was as if winter itself had decided to cradle them, to give them time to adjust, to grieve, to forget the weight of a crown they had never asked for. The Neva remained frozen, the streets quiet, the sky low and gray. From the windows of the winter palace, one could see the spires of the city like dark fingers rising from the white, the domes of the churches half buried, the bridges silent. It was beautiful. It was desolate. It was over. But the world outside was not sleeping. While the Romanovs waited in stillness, the country moved. The provisional government took shape, fragile and uncertain, promising elections, peace, justice. But the people were tired of promises. The soldiers wanted land. The workers wanted control. The peasants wanted food. And in the shadows, a man with a sharp beard and burning eyes returned from exile, stepping off a sealed train with a suitcase and a plan. His name was Lenin, and he did not believe in waiting. The family did not know his name yet. They did not know his face. They only knew that the silence around them was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. It was the silence before a storm, the silence of a world holding its breath. And in the nursery, where Alexei slept beneath thick blankets, a single candle burned low, its flame flickering in the draught from a window that had been left slightly open, as if even the house knew that nothing would ever be sealed away again. They were no longer protected by walls, no longer shielded by tradition, no longer carried by the belief that things would always be as they had been. And in that vulnerability, for the first time, they were truly human. The city breathed differently now, as if it had learned a new rhythm in the dark, a pulse that no longer answered to the measured beat of imperial decree, but to the restless, uneven cadence of a people awakening from a long and dreamless sleep. Petrograd no longer St. Petersburg, though the name still echoed in old letters, and faded street signs moved with a kind of contained urgency, like the quiet hum of a beehive before the swarm takes flight. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold remained, sharp and clear, settling into the bones of the city like a memory that refused to fade, clinging to the rooftops, seeping through the cracks in window frames, frosting the breath of those who walked the streets with their heads down and their hands buried deep in their coats. The canals were still frozen, the Neva a vast sheet of ice cracked in places by the slow pressure beneath, great slabs shifting with a low, groaning sound that carried across the water like a warning. But the silence that had followed the abdication, the stunned hush of a nation holding its breath, had been replaced by something else. A low, constant hum, like the sound of distant machinery, like the murmur of 1,000 conversations held in doorways, in trams, in the corners of half-lit cafes, where men with ink-stained fingers passed newspapers under their coats, their eyes scanning the pages not for news, but for signs. It was the sound of a world reorganizing itself, not with violence, not yet, but with the quiet insistence of people who had finally begun to speak, who had discovered that their voices, when gathered together, could shake the foundations of what had once seemed unshakable. A palace, once the heart of an empire, now stood like a relic in the center of this new life, a monument to a time that had not yet fully ended, but was no longer in command. The guards at the gates wore different uniforms, their faces unfamiliar, their posture less rigid, as if they too were uncertain of their role in this new order. The imperial insignia had been removed, not torn down in anger, not defaced in triumph, but taken down carefully, almost reverently, as if even those who no longer believed in the old order still felt the weight of what it had meant, as if they understood that symbols, once lived in, carry a gravity that outlasts their power. Inside, the Romanovs moved through the same halls, sat in the same rooms, touched the same door handles worn smooth by generations of hands, but the air had changed. It was no longer thick with ceremony, with the invisible weight of centuries of rule. but with waiting a stillness that was not peace, but anticipation, the kind that settles in a house before a storm, when the birds have gone quiet and the light turns gray. The family no longer gave orders, they received them. A new commandant arrived, a man named Korovichenko, stern but not unkind, to oversee their days, to ensure their safety, to remind them, without saying it, that they were no longer in charge of their own fate. Their movements were restricted. Their letters were read before they were sent. Their visitors were few and carefully vetted. And yet there was no cage, not yet only the slow, quiet realization that they were no longer at the center of anything, that the world had turned without them, that history had taken a step forward and left them standing in the snow, watching it go. Nikolai accepted it with a quiet dignity that surprised even those who had doubted him, who had whispered behind closed doors that he was too weak, too indecisive, too much a man of the past to survive the present. He did not rage. He did not plead. He did not retreat into silence or despair. Instead, he walked the garden each morning as he always had, his boots pressing into the frost, his breath rising in soft clouds that vanished into the cold air, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze steady on the path ahead. He read books on gardening, on history, on the lives of men who had lived after losing everything: monks, exiles, philosophers who had chosen simplicity over power. He played chess with Alexei when the boy was strong enough, moving the pieces slowly, thoughtfully, as if each move were a meditation, a way to measure time, to hold on to reason in a world that no longer made sense. He spoke little, but when he did, it was with a calm that seemed to steady the others, a quiet strength that came not from authority, but from presence. He was no longer the Tsar, but he was still a father, still a husband, still a man who believed in the sanctity of small routines, in the dignity of waking up, of washing one's face, of sitting down to a meal with those you love. And so the family followed his lead, not out of duty, but out of need. They ate together. They prayed. They played cards in the evening, their laughter sometimes breaking through the silence like sunlight through clouds, brief and golden and gone too soon. But outside, the world was not quiet. The factories roared back to life, not for the war, not for the empire, but for the people. Workers formed committees, demanding shorter hours, better pay, a voice in how their lives were governed, and when their demands were ignored, they stopped working, not in anger, but in unity, their silence louder than any shout. The streets filled with posters, bold black letters on red paper calling for peace, for land, for bread, their edges fluttering in the wind, like flags of a new nation being born. The Duma, once a cautious advisory body, now argued with fire, its sessions lasting late into the night, its debates broadcast in summaries that spread through the city like sparks on dry grass. And in the barracks, soldiers who had once saluted without question now gathered in circles, reading pamphlets, questioning orders, wondering aloud who they were meant to obey now that the Tsar was gone, their rifles no longer pointing outward, but inward, toward the heart of the old order. The provisional government had taken power, promising elections, promising reform, promising an end to the war. But promises, no matter how sincere, could not fill empty stomachs, could not warm frozen homes, could not bring back the dead. And so the people listened, but they did not believe. The women who had marched in the snow were no longer on the streets, but their presence lingered, like the scent of smoke after a fire. They had started something they could not finish, but they had cracked the ice. Now, others stepped forward, men who had spent their lives in the shadows, speaking in whispers, writing in code, dreaming of a world without kings. And in the midst of it all, a man returned. He arrived not with an army, not with banners, not with the fanfare of a conqueror, but in a sealed train that crossed Germany and rolled into the Finland station under a gray sky, its wheels grinding to a halt in a cloud of steam. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. He was not tall. He was not handsome. He wore a heavy coat and a hat pulled low, his face sharp, his eyes burning with a certainty that few could match, a fire that did not flicker, but burned steady and cold. He stepped onto the platform, and instead of giving a long speech, instead of appealing to reason or patience, he raised his fist and said only, "The people have begun. Now we must finish what they started." And in that moment, the revolution ceased to be a possibility. It became a force, a current, a tide that no wall could hold back. The city listened. The workers listened. The soldiers listened. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the balance of power began to shift. The provisional government still held the ministries, still issued decrees, still believed it could guide Russia toward democracy, as if democracy were a train that could be boarded with tickets and schedules. But it did not understand that the people were no longer asking for reform. They were asking for transformation. They did not want a new government. They wanted a new world one, where land belonged to those who worked it, where factories answered to those who ran them, where peace was not negotiated, but demanded. And Lenin spoke their language. He did not offer compromises. He did not beg for patience. He did not speak of gradual change. He said, "Enough, now." And the more he spoke, the more the crowds grew, until they filled the squares, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with the weight of their voices, until the very ground trembled beneath their feet. Back in the palace, the family felt the tremors, not through news, not through official reports, but through the silences, the way the servants paused before entering a room, the way the guards avoided eye contact, the way the radio, once a source of distant war reports, now crackled with speeches that made little sense to them, filled with words like proletariat, dictatorship of the class, Soviets, terms that sounded like spells from a language they did not know. The children noticed. Anastasia, always the most perceptive, asked why the guards no longer bowed, why they no longer said, "Your Majesty." Olga read the newspapers when no one was looking, her hands trembling as she traced the headlines. Power to the Soviets. All land to the peasants. Peace without annexations. She did not understand all of it, but she understood this. The world they had known was not just gone. It was being erased, rewritten, replaced by something they could not see, but could feel, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Alexandra, more than anyone, felt the loss. She had never trusted the world beyond the palace, and now that world had turned against everything she believed in, against the God she prayed to, against the son she had fought so hard to save. She lit more candles before the icons, their flames dancing in the dim light, casting long shadows on the walls. She prayed longer, her lips moving in silence, her hands clutching the cross around her neck until the metal left marks on her skin. She wrote in her diary, not to be read, not to be saved, but to hold on to something real, something that could not be taken. God will protect us. He has not abandoned us. He cannot. But even in her faith, there was a tremor, a question she did not speak aloud, a whisper in the dark. If he is with us, why does no one come? Why does no one help? Why does the world turn away? The seasons turned. Spring came slowly, melting the snow, uncovering the city like a body emerging from a long sleep. The Neva cracked and groaned as the ice broke apart, great sheets floating downstream, colliding with the bridges, carrying with them the remnants of winter, the frozen branches, the lost gloves, the forgotten boots. The gardens of the palace bloomed again, the crocuses pushing through the damp earth, the cherry trees bursting into white, their petals falling like snow in reverse. Life returned, as it always did, indifferent to human sorrow. But it was a different life. The birds sang, but the streets were louder. The sun warmed the stones, but the air carried tension, like the moment before a storm, when the wind stills and the light turns silver and everything feels too quiet. The family was told they would not stay in the Winter Palace. It was no longer safe, the officials said. Too many memories. Too many symbols. And so, plans were made to move them to Tobolsk, a quiet town in Siberia, far from the capital, far from the noise. It was not a prison, they were told. It was protection. And yet, the word move carried its own weight. It meant leaving behind the only home they had ever known, the walls that had held their laughter, their tears, their secrets. It meant packing their belongings, not for a journey, but for exile. The children helped, folding their clothes, wrapping their books, placing their toys into wooden crates, their movements careful, as if handling something fragile. They did not cry. They did not argue. They simply obeyed, as if they already understood that obedience was all they had left, that resistance was no longer possible, that the world had moved on without them. Nikolai walked through the emptying rooms, touching the walls, the door frames, the windowsills, places his hands had passed over 1,000 times, places where his children had left pencil marks to measure their growth, where Alexandra had hung portraits of her mother, where Alexei had once crawled across the floor, laughing. He did not say goodbye. He did not need to. The house knew him. It had held his laughter, his grief, his footsteps, his breath, and now it would hold someone else. The weight of that thought settled over him, not as sorrow, but as acceptance. Empires rise, empires fall. Men rule, men vanish. But the earth remains, the seasons turn, and life, in some form, goes on. As the train prepared to leave Petrograd, the city watched, not in anger, not in celebration, but in silence. A crowd gathered at the station, not to shout, not to throw stones, but to witness the last moment of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. The children, dressed in coats too warm for the spring air, stepped onto the platform, holding their parents' hands. Alexei leaned on his father's arm, his face pale but calm, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd as if searching for a familiar smile. Alexandra kept her head high, her veil drawn, her rosary in her pocket, her lips moving in silent prayer. Nikolai looked straight ahead, not at the people, not at the sky, but at the train, as if focusing on the next step would make the rest bearable, as if the journey itself could carry them away from what was coming. The journey to Tobolsk took days. The train moved slowly, stopping often, guarded at every station, its windows covered with curtains, its doors locked from the outside. The family stayed in the same car, their world reduced to the creak of the floorboards, the rumble of the wheels, the occasional voice of a guard outside, the soft breathing of the children as they slept in the narrow berths. The land outside unfolded endless forests, frozen rivers, small villages where people paused to watch the train pass, not knowing who was inside, only sensing that something important was moving through their world. The children played quiet games, read books, tried to sleep, but the air was thick with the unspoken. Where are we going? Will we come back? What happens when we get there? When they arrived, Tobolsk welcomed them not with ceremony, not with banners, but with snow. The house assigned to them was large, once belonging to a wealthy merchant, surrounded by a wooden fence, watched by guards who stood in the yard, their breath rising in clouds. It was not a palace. It had no ballrooms, no chandeliers, no armies. But it had warmth. It had light. It had a garden. And for a moment, as the family stepped inside, as the doors closed behind them, as the first fire was lit in the stove, it almost felt like home. Almost. But the world was still in motion. The revolution was not finished. And the silence between the snowflakes was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. The house in Tobolsk stood on the edge of a world that seemed to hold its breath. Nestled between the frozen banks of the Tobol River and the dense Siberian forest that stretched endlessly to the east, its wooden beams darkened by decades of snow and wind, its windows small and deeply set like eyes watching the long winter pass. It had once belonged to a wealthy merchant who traded in furs and grain, a man who filled its rooms with laughter and the clatter of dinner parties. But now it held a different kind of life, one measured not in wealth or power, but in silence, in routine, in the quiet courage of a family, learning how to exist when the world outside is moved on without them. The snow lay thick on the roof and piled against the fence that now enclosed the property, a barrier not of luxury but of control, patrolled by guards whose footsteps crunched in the frost each morning as they changed shifts, their breath rising in steady clouds, their rifles held not in aggression but in duty. This was no palace, no imperial residence, yet it had become the center of a silent drama, a place where the weight of history was carried not in grand gestures, but in the way a hand hesitated before turning a page, in the way a mother watched her child sleep, in the way a father walked the same few steps in the garden each morning as if reclaiming a piece of himself. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of pine from the stove, and the faint musk of wool blankets left too long near the fire, a smell that clung to the walls and the heavy curtains drawn against the cold. The family had brought little with them personal belongings, photographs, a few books, the children's dolls and toys, but they had arranged them with care, placing each object as if it could restore a sense of order, as if the familiar weight of a teacup or the sight of a childhood drawing could make this exile feel like a home. The walls were lined with familiar portraits, not of emperors or saints, but of grandparents, of cousins, of dogs long gone, their faces gazing out from oval frames as if still part of the family's daily life, their eyes following the slow passage of days. The rooms were small compared to the winter palace, the ceilings lower, the corridors narrow, but there was a kind of intimacy in that closeness, a feeling that no one was ever truly alone, that every sigh, every whisper, every footstep was shared, that even in confinement they were still together, still breathing the same air, still living the same fragile peace. Nikolai rose early each morning, as he always had, and dressed without assistance, folding his clothes neatly, buttoning each button with deliberate care, his hands moving slowly, as if each gesture were a ritual meant to anchor him in the present. He no longer wore a uniform, but a simple wool coat, dark and plain, the kind any man in the town might wear, a deliberate choice to shed the last symbols of a life that no longer existed. He walked to the window, watched the first light touch the snow, listened to the creak of the ice on the river as it shifted under the weight of thawing water, a sound that echoed through the stillness like a heartbeat. He did not look for escape. He did not plan resistance. He simply lived, moment by moment, as if the only way to honor what had been lost was to remain present in what remained, to meet each day with dignity, with quiet attention, with the unspoken understanding that even a life stripped of power could still carry meaning. He kept a journal now, not of state affairs, but of small things, the weather, the children's moods, the name of the guard who brought the morning bread. He wrote not for history, but for himself, as a way to measure time, to confirm that he still existed, that his life, though stripped of empire, still had rhythm and purpose. Alexandra spent her days in prayer, not in the grand chapels of the capital, but in a corner of the sitting room where she had placed her icons on a small table, covered with a cloth of deep red, the fabric worn at the edges from years of use. She lit candles each morning and evening, their flames flickering against the wood, casting long shadows that moved like silent companions across the walls, their light trembling with every draught that slipped through the cracks in the windows. She read from her prayer book in a voice, so low it was nearly soundless, her lips forming the words with a devotion that seemed to draw energy from some deep well within her, as if faith were the only thing keeping her body upright, her mind steady. She did not speak much to the others, not out of coldness, but because her thoughts were turned inward. tangled in a web of faith and fear, of love and sorrow. She believed God would protect them. She believed he had chosen them for this trial. But belief, no matter how strong, could not silence the questions that came in the dark. Why had they been brought so far? Why were they watched like criminals? Why did no one come to help? And yet, she did not stop praying, because to stop would be to admit defeat, and she was not ready to do that. The children adapted in their own ways, each finding a role in the quiet economy of survival that had taken root within the house. Olga, the eldest, took on a quiet leadership, not by command, but by presence. She helped organize the daily routine, reminded the others of lessons, sat with Alexei when he was in pain, her hand resting on his forehead as if to absorb some of his suffering. Her diary entries grew longer, more reflective, filled with observations about the guards, the weather, the way the light fell through the windows in the late afternoon, as if she were trying to preserve every detail of this life before it vanished. She wrote of missing the garden in Petrograd, of wondering if the roses had bloomed this year, of dreaming of a life where she could walk freely, where her name meant nothing, where she could be just a woman, not a grand duchess. Tatiana, always gentle, devoted herself to care, not just of her brother, but of the family's emotional balance. She noticed when someone was sad, when a silence had lasted too long, and she would bring tea, or play a soft tune on the piano they had managed to bring, her fingers moving slowly over the keys, as if afraid to disturb the air, as if music were a fragile thing that could break if played too loudly. Maria was warmth itself, open, affectionate, unwilling to let the weight of their situation crush the joy she still found in small things. She laughed easily, hugged without hesitation, played games with the younger ones, even when they had played them 100 times before, inventing new rules just to keep them smiling. She wrote letters to friends they had left behind, though she knew the letters would never be sent, filling them with descriptions of the house, the snow, the stars, as if keeping a record for a future that might never come, as if the act of writing could keep the outside world alive in her mind. Anastasia, the youngest, was the most restless, her energy contained but not extinguished. She drew cartoons of the guards, wrote silly poems, whispered jokes to Alexei under the covers at night, her voice low but bright, a spark in the darkness. She asked questions no one could answer. When can we go home? Will we ever see our dogs again? Do you think people still remember us? But she did not wait for answers. She lived in the moment, in the next game, the next drawing, the next shared laugh, as if refusing to let the future steal the present. Alexei, fragile but unbroken, lived each day as a gift. His illness still held him, still brought pain that made him cry out in the night, still forced him to stay in bed for days at a time. But he was no longer just a sick child. He was becoming aware of the world around him, of the tension in his parents' voices, of the way the guards watched them, of the fact that they were not free. He asked about the war, about the people, about why they could not leave. He read adventure stories, books about sailors and explorers, tracing the routes of ships across vast oceans with his finger, dreaming of a life where he could move freely, where the wind would not feel like a threat, where his legs would not betray him. When he was strong enough, he walked with his father in the small garden, leaning on his arm, speaking in a voice that was still soft, but no longer afraid. He did not speak of the future. He did not ask for miracles. He simply lived with a quiet courage that came not from strength, but from love. The seasons turned. Winter gave way to spring, slowly, as if reluctant to release its hold. The snow melted in patches, revealing the damp earth beneath, and the river swelled with runoff, its voice growing louder as the ice broke apart. The family watched from the windows, as if the changing world outside mirrored the slow transformation within them. They were no longer the Romanovs of the palace, no longer the symbols of an empire. They were becoming something else, something smaller, quieter, more human. They ate together at the same table every evening, their meals simple but shared, their conversations careful but real. They celebrated birthdays with small cakes, with songs, with gifts made by hand. They marked the passage of time not by decrees or ceremonies, but by the rhythm of their days, by the way the light moved across the floor, by the way a bird returned to the same branch each morning, by the way the stove needed more wood as the nights grew colder again. But the silence around them was not peaceful. It was watchful. The guards changed shifts with regularity, their presence a constant reminder that they were not free to leave, that every letter was read, every visitor questioned, every movement noted. The commandant, though not cruel, enforced the rules without hesitation. The children were not allowed to play beyond the fence. The parents could not walk into the town. The servants who had come with them were treated as prisoners too, their loyalty now a burden rather than a privilege. And yet, within the house, a different kind of strength grew, not loud, not defiant, but steady, like the flame of a candle in a closed room, protected from the wind, burning with a quiet insistence that refused to be extinguished. Nikolai did not speak of politics. He did not dwell on the past. But he read the newspapers when they were brought, his face calm, his eyes scanning the lines for any sign of change. He saw the provisional government weakening, saw the rise of the Bolsheviks, saw the names of men who had once been exiles now holding power. He did not comment. He did not warn. He simply absorbed it, as a man might watch a storm approach from the horizon, knowing he cannot stop it, but needing to understand its path. Alexandra, when she saw the papers, turned away. She did not want to know. She did not want to hope. She had given her faith to God, and she would not share it with the world that had betrayed them. The children, though shielded as much as possible, felt the tension. They heard the radio, faint and crackling, bringing voices that spoke of revolution, of power, of a new Russia. They saw the way their parents exchanged glances when certain names were mentioned. They knew, without being told, that their lives were not their own, that every day was a gift that could be taken back. And yet they did not break. They played. They studied. They loved. They held on to each other with a quiet courage that was not born of heroism, but of necessity. To cry too long was to give in. To rage was to lose. So they endured, not with grand speeches, but with small acts of resistance. A shared smile, a hidden joke, a hand held beneath the table, a song hummed in the dark. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold, the family gathered in the sitting room. The stove glowed with embers. The lamps cast soft pools of light on the floor. Alexei lay on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes half closed but listening. Anastasia played a melody on the piano, slow and tender, one she had learned before they left. Olga read aloud from a novel, her voice steady, her words filling the space like warmth. Tatiana knitted a scarf, her needles clicking softly. Maria sat beside her mother, who had closed her prayer book and was staring into the fire, her face unreadable. Nikolai sat in his chair, his hands folded, his gaze moving from one child to the next, as if memorizing them, as if storing each face, each breath, each quiet moment in a place where nothing could take it away. In that moment, there was no empire, no throne, no war, no guards. There was only a family, together, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. It was not happiness, not exactly. It was something deeper, a kind of peace that comes not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of love. A courage that does not shout, but whispers. A strength that does not fight, but holds on. They knew the world was moving without them. They knew the storm was not over. But in that room, in that hour, they were safe. Not from what was coming, but from the fear that had threatened to consume them. They had lost nearly everything, but they had not lost each other. And in that truth, quiet and unshakable, they found a kind of victory that no revolution could take away. As the fire dimmed and the children one by one drifted to sleep, Nikolai rose and walked to the window. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, cold and distant, but constant. The guards stood at their posts, motionless. The river murmured beneath the ice. And the house, small and humble as it was, stood like a fortress of stillness in a world that had forgotten how to rest. They were not free. They were not safe. But they were together, and in the depth of that togetherness, in the quiet courage of simply enduring, there was a kind of wholeness that no prison, no exile, no silence could ever destroy. The air in Tobolsk that summer carried a stillness, so thick it seemed to press against the walls of the house, as if the entire landscape had paused in anticipation of something too vast to name. The days stretched endlessly beneath a sky that never fully darkened, the pale northern twilight lingering long after midnight, casting a dreamlike haze over the frozen river, the snow-dusted trees, the wooden fence that now felt less like a boundary and more like a threshold. Inside, the family moved through their routines with a quiet precision, each gesture measured, each word chosen with care, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile peace they had built. The children no longer ran through the halls or laughed without restraint. Their voices had softened and movements grown slower, as if they too sensed that the world beyond the yard was no longer waiting for them to return, but had already moved on. Even the guards who patrolled the perimeter walked with a different rhythm, their boots crunching in the frost not with urgency, but with the weight of duty, their eyes often lingering on the windows, as if they too were waiting for the next chapter to begin. News arrived in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle, delivered one at a time, each one incomplete but carrying the unmistakable weight of change. Messengers came from the capital with sealed envelopes, their faces unreadable, their words few, handing over the dispatches to the commandant before vanishing back into the cold. The report spoke of chaos of ministries collapsing, of regiments refusing orders, of cities erupting in unrest. The provisional government, once hailed as the bridge to a new Russia, was unraveling, its leaders paralyzed by indecision, their promises of peace and reform drowned out by the rising tide of revolution. And at the center of it all stood one man, whose name now echoed through factories, barracks, and train stations like a drumbeat. Lenin. He was no longer just a voice from exile. He was a force, a presence, a man who spoke not of compromise, but of total transformation, who demanded not reform, but revolution. He did not ask for loyalty. He commanded it. And the people, exhausted by war, by hunger, by years of waiting, began to answer. Inside the house, Nikolai read the reports in silence, his face calm, his hands steady as he turned each page. He did not react with anger or despair. He simply absorbed the words, letting them settle into the deep well of his understanding, as a man might watch a storm gather on the horizon, knowing he cannot stop it, but needing to see its path. He saw the writing not in bold declarations, but in the silences between the lines, the resignation of ministers, the defection of entire regiments, the growing power of the Soviets. He knew, with a quiet certainty that required no proof, that there would be no return, no restoration, no second chance. The world they had known was not merely fading. It was being erased, rewritten by hands that had no interest in the past, no respect for tradition, no patience for mercy. And yet, he said nothing of this to his family. He carried it alone, as he had carried so much, his grief not in tears, but in the way he lingered at the window each evening, watching the light fade over the trees, as if memorizing the last beauty they would ever know together. Alexandra felt it too, though she refused to name it. She continued her prayers with the same devotion, lighting her candles at dawn and dusk, her rosary moving through her fingers like a second pulse, the beads worn smooth by years of repetition. But her prayers grew shorter, her silences longer. She no longer wrote in her diary. She no longer asked about the news. She turned away when the newspapers were brought in, as if refusing to see could somehow protect them. And yet, in the middle of the night, she would rise and stand before the icons, her hands pressed together, her lips moving in silent supplication, her eyes closed as if she could shut out the world. She believed in God. She believed in fate. She believed that divine will had placed them on this path and would carry them through. But belief, no matter how strong, could not stop the slow erosion of hope, the way a river wears down stone, grain by grain, until nothing remains. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the house was still and the children slept, she would press her forehead against the cold wood of the icon frame and whisper, not for deliverance, but for strength to endure, to protect, to love, even as everything crumbled. The children, though shielded as much as possible, felt the shift in the air, not as a single event, but as a slow, steady pressure, like the weight of deep water. They no longer played as freely. They no longer laughed as loudly. They gathered in the sitting room in the evenings, not to read or play games, but simply to be together, their presence a silent reassurance that they were still a family, still whole. Olga sat with a book in her lap, though she rarely turned the pages, her eyes scanning the same line over and over, her thoughts far away. Tatiana knitted a scarf that never seemed to grow longer, her needles clicking softly, the wool wrapped around her fingers like a tether to the present. Maria leaned against her mother's chair, her head resting on her shoulder, her eyes closed, as if drawing warmth from the simple fact of closeness. Anastasia, usually the most restless, sat still for long stretches, her fingers tracing patterns on the arm of the sofa, her gaze fixed on the fire, as if watching the flames could reveal a future they could not yet see. And Alexei, pale and thin, lay on the sofa beneath a woolen blanket, his breathing slow and even, his eyes open but unfocused, as if he were listening to something far away, something only he could hear. Then came the telegram. It arrived on a morning when the sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain, the kind of day that feels like a held breath. The commandant received it in private, read it once, then again, his face unreadable. He did not announce it immediately. He waited until evening, when the family was gathered for dinner, the table lit by a single lamp, the room filled with the scent of boiled potatoes and black bread, the kind of meal that had become their normal. He stood at the door, his hat in his hands, and spoke with a formality that made the air grow colder. The order had come from the new authorities in Moscow. The Romanovs were to be moved, not to another town, not to a safer house, but to Yekaterinburg, a city deep in the Ural Mountains, far from Siberia, far from any place they knew. The reason was not given. The timing was immediate. They would leave within days. No one spoke. The silence that followed was not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of shock, the kind that comes when the ground gives way beneath your feet and there is nothing to grab onto. The children looked at their parents, their eyes wide, their hands still. Alexandra closed her eyes and pressed a hand to her chest, as if to steady her heart. Nikolai nodded slowly, as if he had expected this, as if he had been waiting for the other shoe to fall. He thanked the commandant, his voice calm, his posture straight, and asked only for time to prepare. The man bowed slightly and left, closing the door behind him with a soft click that echoed through the room like a final verdict. The lamp flickered, the fire in the stove crackled, and the family sat in silence, not moving, not speaking, as if the act of breathing too deeply might make it real. That night, no one slept. The house remained lit long after the lamps should have been extinguished. The children sat together in the sitting room, wrapped in blankets, speaking in whispers. They did not cry. They did not rage. They simply talked about the journey, about the city they had never seen, about whether they would be allowed to bring their books, their photos, their dog. They tried to imagine the house they would live in, the yard they might walk, the sky they would see each morning. But their words were hollow, filled with a fear they could not name. They knew, without being told, that this was not just another move. This was something else. This was a step deeper into the unknown, into a place where the air itself might be hostile, where the walls might not shelter them, where the guards might not look away when they wept. Nikolai and Alexandra stayed in their room, not speaking, not praying, just sitting in the dim light, their hands clasped between them. They did not need to say what they both knew, that Yekaterinburg was a Bolshevik stronghold, that the people there had no love for the old regime, that the guards would not be kind, that the house would not be a home. They had heard the rumors. They knew what was possible, and yet they could not protect their children from it. They could not shield them. All they could do was stay with them, stand beside them, hold their hands as the world closed in. There was no plan, no escape, no last appeal. Only the quiet understanding that their fate was no longer theirs to shape. And in that surrender, there was a kind of dignity, a courage not of action, but of presence. The next day, they began to pack. There was little to take, but each object carried weight. The children chose their favorite books, their diaries, a few photographs, a doll, a scarf. They folded their clothes carefully, placed them in wooden crates that would be carried onto the train. They said goodbye to the garden, to the piano, to the window where they had watched the snow fall. They did not cry. They did not protest. They simply obeyed, as if the act of packing could give them back a sense of control, as if order in the small things could stave off chaos in the large. They touched the walls one last time, the door frames, the floorboards, as if imprinting the memory of this place into their palms, knowing they might never see it again. When the train arrived, it was not the same one that had brought them to Tobolsk. This was a freight car, repurposed for passengers, its walls bare, its floor covered in straw, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and coal smoke. The guards stood in formation, their faces stern, their rifles held across their chests. The family climbed aboard in silence, helping Alexei up the steps, supporting him as he crossed the threshold. The doors were closed behind them. The lock turned, and as the engine whistled and the wheels began to turn, the house in Tobolsk shrank in the distance, its windows dark, its yard empty, as if it had already forgotten them, as if their presence had been nothing more than a brief shadow on its walls. The journey was long, slow, filled with stops and searches, with guards boarding the car to inspect their belongings, to question them, to remind them who was in charge. The children sat close together, their heads resting on each other's shoulders, their eyes closed. Alexandra prayed silently, her lips moving without sound. Nikolai stared out the small barred window, watching the forests pass, the rivers, the villages where people paused to watch the train go by, unaware of who was inside. He did not look back. He looked forward, not with hope, but with acceptance. He knew they were not going to safety. He knew they were going into the heart of the storm. And yet, in that moment, as the train carried them deeper into the Urals, there was a strange kind of peace. Not because the danger had passed, but because the waiting had ended. The uncertainty, the slow dread, the endless wondering now, it was over. They knew what was coming, even if they did not know the details. They were no longer drifting. They were moving toward something. And in that clarity, there was a kind of courage. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that sits in silence, that holds a child's hand, that breathes steadily through the dark. When they arrived in Yekaterinburg, the sky was gray, the air thick with coal smoke. The house they were taken to stood behind high wooden walls, its windows boarded, its yard patrolled by armed men. It was not a home. It was a prison. The Ipativ house, they called it, though it had once belonged to a wealthy industrialist. Now it bore no name but fear. The walls had been reinforced, the yard cleared of trees, the windows covered with shutters. Guards stood at every corner, their rifles ready, their eyes cold. And as they stepped inside, the door closing behind them with a sound like a tomb sealing shut, they understood at last that they would not leave, not as they had come, not together, not alive. But even then, in that moment of finality, they did not break. They held each other. They whispered. They lit a candle. And in the dim light, they were still a family, still whole, still human. And for now, that was enough. The Ippative house did not welcome them. It did not offer shelter so much as containment, its walls rising like the sides of a well, its windows boarded as if to keep not only the world out, but the light as well. Once it had been a private home, built for a man who traded in iron and coal, its rooms spacious, its floors polished, its yard open to the summer sun. But now, every trace of warmth had been stripped away. The garden was cleared, the trees cut down, the fences reinforced with barbed wire. Guards stood at every corner, their boots crunching on the gravel, their rifles never far from hand. The family was led through a side door into a series of rooms on the upper floor, their new world reduced to 4 walls, a narrow hallway, and a single staircase watched day and night. There were no greetings, no introductions, only silence, and the slow, deliberate locking of the door behind them, a sound so final it seemed to echo through the bones of the house, as if sealing not just a room, but a fate. Inside, the air was still and close, thick with the scent of damp plaster and old wood, the kind of smell that settles in a house that no longer breathes, where the walls have absorbed too much silence, and the floors remember every footstep as if it were the last. The rooms were small, their ceilings low, their windows covered with heavy shutters that allowed only slivers of light to slip through, painting thin golden lines across the floorboards in the late afternoon, lines that moved slowly with the sun, like the hands of a clock counting down hours no one wanted to name. The furniture was sparse wooden chairs, a table, a few beds brought in from storage, their mattresses thin and lumpy, the kind that offered no comfort, only function. There were no portraits on the walls, no curtains at the windows, no rugs to soften the cold. It was not meant to feel like a home. It was meant to feel like a pause, a holding place, a threshold between one world and the next. And yet, the family did not resist. They did not complain. They simply entered, removed their coats, and began the quiet work of making this space their own, folding blankets, arranging pillows, placing a single photograph on the dresser. A small act of defiance, not against their captors, but against the erasure they sensed all around them. A quiet insistence that they were still people, still a family, still alive. Nikolai walked through the room slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes taking in every detail, as if memorizing the shape of their prison, as if every crack in the wall, every loose floorboard, every shadow in the corner might one day be needed to recall this moment in full. He did not speak. He did not sigh. He simply moved from room to room, touching the walls, testing the floorboards, standing for a long time at the window, where a single crack in the shutter allowed him to see a sliver of sky, a narrow strip of gray with a single bird crossing it, so distant it looked like a speck of ash. He knew, as only a man who had ruled an empire could know, that this was not a temporary arrangement. This was not exile. This was the end of a journey that had begun long before, in the halls of the Winter Palace, in the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo, in the quiet mornings when he had believed that duty and love could be enough to hold a nation together. He had carried that belief for 23 years, through war, through illness, through the slow unraveling of trust. And now, here, in this dim house in the Urals, he let it go. Not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a quiet acceptance. like a man who finally understands that some storms cannot be weathered, only endured, that some paths do not lead forward, but inward, to a place where power means nothing, and presence means everything. Alexandra did not weep. She did not collapse. She lit a candle that evening, as she had every evening for decades, placing it before the small icon she had carried with her from Tobolsk, the paint chipped at the edges, the gold fading, but still glowing in the dark. The flame flickered in the draught, casting long shadows on the wall, and for a moment it seemed to dance like a living thing, a spark of warmth in the growing cold. She knelt before it, her hands folded, her lips moving in silent prayer, her voice so low it was nearly soundless. Not meant for God, perhaps, but for herself, a rhythm to steady her breath, a thread to hold on to. She did not ask for freedom. She did not beg for rescue. She asked only for strength, for herself, for her children, for the man beside her who had loved her through every trial, who had stood by her when the world called her a foreigner, a witch, a curse. And in that prayer there was no illusion. She knew they were not safe. She knew the world had turned against them. But she also knew that faith was not the absence of fear. It was the decision to love anyway, to believe anyway, to kneel in the dark and light a candle even when no one would see it burn, even when the walls felt like they were closing in, even when the footsteps outside never stopped. The children gathered in the sitting room that first night, not because they were told to, but because they needed to be together, as if their proximity could create a warmth no stove could provide. They sat on the floor, wrapped in blankets, their backs against the wall, their heads close, their breaths rising in small clouds in the cold air. They did not speak much. They did not laugh. They simply listened to the creak of the floor above, to the distant voice of a guard outside, to the faint hum of the city beyond the walls, to the silence between their heartbeats. Olga held her diary in her lap, but she did not write. Tatiana traced the pattern of the wood grain with her finger, as if reading a map only she could see, a path that might lead them out. Maria leaned against Anastasia, her eyes closed, her breathing slow, as if trying to sleep while awake. And Anastasia, usually the first to break the silence, sat still, her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on the candle flame, as if it held the answer to everything, as if it could tell her what would happen tomorrow, or the day after, or if there would even be a day after. Alexei lay on a narrow bed in the next room, his legs wrapped in bandages, his face pale but calm, his breathing shallow but steady. The journey had taken its toll. The pain had returned, sharper than before, and he had not walked since they arrived. But he did not cry out. He did not call for help. He simply lay there, his eyes open, watching the light move across the ceiling, the way the shadow of the shutter shifted with the sun, the way the dust floated in the air like tiny stars. When his sisters came to sit with him, he smiled, weakly, and asked if they had seen the stars the night before. They told him no, the sky had been overcast. He nodded, as if that were enough, and closed his eyes, his breathing slow and even, like the tide pulling back from the shore, like a man who has accepted that some things are beyond his control. Days passed, then weeks, each one folding into the next like pages in a book with no ending, each morning beginning with the same ritual. Tea brought by a guard, poured into chipped cups, the milk often sour, the sugar rationed, the silence heavier than the day before. Nikolai shaved by the window, using a mirror propped on the sill, his hands steady despite the cold. Alexandra prayed at dawn and dusk, her rosary moving through her fingers like a second pulse. The children helped clean, folded clothes, read aloud from the few books they had brought, their voices soft, their eyes often lifting to the ceiling as if listening for something beyond the roof. They played quiet games, cards, chess, riddles, anything to fill the silence, to keep their minds from wandering into the dark. They marked the days on a calendar drawn by Anastasia, A simple grid on a sheet of paper, each box crossed off with a pencil, the lines growing shakier as time wore on. They did not speak of the future. They did not plan. They simply lived, moment by moment, as if the act of enduring were the only victory left to them, the only way to say, without words, that they were still here, still breathing, still a family. And yet, in that stillness, something unexpected began to grow. Not hope, not exactly, but a kind of clarity, a stripping away of everything that had ever defined them, the titles, the ceremonies, the expectations, the weight of centuries of rule. Beneath it all, they found something simpler, more enduring. Each other. There were no audiences here. No ministers, no crowds. There was only a mother, a father, 4 daughters, 1 son, learning how to be human in a world that had forgotten them. They sat at the same table for every meal, their voices low, their hands touching as they passed the bread, their laughter rare but real when it came. They told stories from their childhood, not grand tales of palaces and coronations, but small memories, a lost dog, a snowball fight, a song their nanny used to sing. And in those moments, they were not the Romanovs. They were not the last Tsar and his family. They were simply people bound not by blood alone, but by the quiet courage of staying together when everything else had been taken. Nikolai read more than he ever had. He devoured books on history, on philosophy, on the lives of men who had lived after losing everything: kings, philosophers, monks, exiles. He underlined passages, made notes in the margins, as if preparing for a conversation that would never happen. He did not read to escape. He read to understand, to make sense of what had been, and what was now. And in those pages, he found a strange kind of peace. Not because the answers were there, but because the questions were. He saw himself in the stories of fallen emperors, of men who had carried crowns too heavy for any one person, of rulers who had believed in divine, right until the day the doors were kicked in. And he realized, at last, that leadership was not in the holding of power, but in the letting go of it, in the quiet dignity of accepting that some things cannot be saved, only honored. Alexandra, too, changed. The woman who had once trembled at the thought of being seen, who had hidden behind veils and silence, now stood taller, spoke more, held her children closer, her touch more deliberate, her presence more grounded. She no longer prayed only for deliverance. She began to pray for acceptance, for grace, for the strength to face whatever came without turning away, without breaking. And in that surrender, she found a kind of freedom, not from captivity, but from fear. She was no longer fighting. She was being. And in that stillness, she was more present than she had ever been, more herself than she had been in decades, stripped of the roles that had defined her, and left with only what mattered: love. The children grew quieter, but not weaker. Their laughter came less often, but when it did, it was deeper, more real, or not of ignorance, but of resilience. They stopped asking when they would go home. They stopped dreaming of palaces. Instead, they found joy in small things: a bird that landed on the windowsill, a patch of sunlight on the floor, a letter from a servant they had left behind, smuggled in by a sympathetic guard, the paper worn at the edges, the ink faded, but the words clear. They wrote in their diaries, not of politics or history, but of each other, of the way Tatiana hummed when she was nervous, of how Maria always saved the last piece of bread for Alexei, of how Anastasia could make anyone laugh with a single word. They were learning, without knowing it, that love is not measured in grand gestures, but in the 1,000 small ways we care for one another when no one is watching, when no one is recording history, when the world has turned its back. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees beyond the wall, casting a soft gold light through the crack in the shutter, the family gathered in the sitting room. The stove glowed with embers. The lamp flickered. Alexei lay on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes half closed but listening. Anastasia played a melody on a small harmonica she had kept hidden in her coat, slow and tender, one she had learned in Tobolsk, the notes soft and wavering, like a lullaby from another life. Olga read aloud from a novel, her voice steady, her words filling the space like warmth. Tatiana knitted a scarf, her needles clicking softly. Maria sat beside her mother, who had closed her prayer book and was staring into the fire, her face unreadable, her hands resting on her lap. Nikolai sat in his chair, his hands folded, his gaze moving from one child to the next, as if memorizing them, as if storing each face, each breath, each quiet moment in a place where nothing could take it away, as if he already knew that this was the last time they would all be together, and he wanted to carry it with him into whatever came next. In that moment, there was no empire, no throne, no war, no guards. There was only a family, together, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. It was not happiness, not exactly. It was something deeper, a kind of peace that comes not from the absence of pain, but from the presence of love. A courage that does not shout, but whispers. A strength that does not fight, but holds on. They had lost their freedom. They had lost their future. But they had not lost their dignity. They had not lost their love. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the heart of the storm, that was enough. Not to change the world, not to survive, but to remain human, to remain together, to face the unknown with their hands clasped and their hearts open, as if the final victory was not in escape, but in staying true to who they had always been, even when no one was left to remember. The air inside the Ipatiev house had changed, not in temperature or light, but in weight, as if the very atmosphere had grown denser with the passing of days, each one folding into the next, like layers of fabric wrapped around a silence too deep to name. The family still moved through their routine's morning tea, shared meals, quiet reading, the soft murmur of prayers, but the rhythm had slowed, as though they were no longer marking time so much as waiting for it to catch up with them. The guards outside remained constant, their boots crunching on the gravel, their voices low and infrequent, but their presence was no longer a shock. It had become part of the landscape, like the boarded windows, like the cold that seeped through the walls, like the way the candle flame trembled in the draught from a door left open too long. And yet, within this stillness, something had begun to shift, not in the world beyond the walls, but within the family itself. A quiet transformation that moved not with force, but with the slow certainty of roots growing beneath stone, a deepening of presence, a turning inward that revealed not despair, but a kind of clarity born from the stripping away of everything that had ever defined them. Nikolai no longer walked the rooms as if inspecting a prison. He moved through them like a man at home, his steps measured, his hands resting on the back of a chair, his gaze lingering on the faces of his children, as if storing every detail in a place beyond memory, a vault where time could not reach. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a weight that made the others pause, not because of authority, but because of their quiet truth. He told stories now, not of empires or battles, not of decrees or coronations, but of his own father, of quiet evenings in Gatchina, of walks through the forest where the only sound was the wind in the pines, the crunch of snow underfoot, the distant call of a bird at dusk. He spoke of duty, not as a burden imposed by bloodline, but as a choice made in love, as something one carried not for glory, but for the sake of those who depended on you. And in those moments, he was not the last Tsar of Russia. He was simply a father, passing on what little he could before the world took even that away, offering not power, but presence, not command, but care. Alexandra, too, had settled into a kind of stillness that was not resignation, but acceptance, a deepening of the faith that had always been her anchor, now no longer directed toward deliverance, but toward endurance. She no longer lit candles in the hope that someone would see them, that help would come, that the world would remember. Instead, her prayers became quieter, more intimate, as if she were no longer speaking to God, but listening, as if the act of silence itself had become her devotion. She spent hours sitting beside Alexei's bed, smoothing his hair, holding his hand, whispering words too soft to be heard, not stories, not promises, but simple affirmations. I am here, my love. I am here, as if repetition could make the moment last forever. She did not try to distract him. She did not pretend. She simply stayed, her presence a kind of shelter, a reminder that even in pain, he was not alone. That love could not cure, but could accompany, could witness, could remain. The children, once so eager to escape the confines of their lives, now found a strange kind of freedom in the smallness of their world. There were no audiences, no expectations, no roles to perform. They were not grand duchesses. They were not the heirs to an empire. They were simply sisters, bound together not by blood alone, but by the thousand small acts of care that had grown in the silence. Maria bringing tea when someone shivered, Tatiana reading aloud when the light was too dim to write, Olga mending a torn sleeve with careful stitches, Anastasia making up silly songs to make Alexei smile, humming them under her breath as she lay in bed. They no longer dreamed of palaces or balls. They dreamed of simple things, a walk in the forest, a warm room, a morning without pain, the sound of birds outside a window they could not see. And in those dreams, there was no bitterness, only a quiet longing for peace, for a life where the only duty was to love and be loved in return. Alexei, though weakened by illness, had become the quiet center of their world, not because he was the heir, but because his fragility reminded them of what mattered. He did not speak often, but when he did, his voice was clear, his questions thoughtful, not about the future, not about escape, but about the stars, about the sea, about what it would be like to sail a ship across an open ocean, to feel the wind in his face, to stand on the deck as the horizon stretched endlessly ahead. He read books on navigation, tracing the routes of explorers with his finger, as if memorizing the paths they had taken, imagining himself at the helm, strong, free, alive. He did not rage against his body. He did not curse his fate. He simply lived, with a courage that was not loud, but steady, like the flame of a candle that refuses to go out, even when the wind presses against it, even when the room grows colder, even when the light begins to fade. One afternoon, as the sun cast a narrow beam of light through the crack in the shutter, Anastasia took out a small notebook she had kept hidden in the lining of her coat. It was filled with drawings of the garden in Tobolsk, of their dogs, of the palace in Petrograd, of her family sitting together, their faces soft, their postures relaxed, as if captured in a moment of peace. She had drawn them not with precision, not to impress, but with feeling, her lines soft, her shading uneven, but full of life, as if her hand remembered what her eyes could no longer see. She showed them to her sisters, one by one, and they gathered around, their heads close, their voices low as they recognized each scene, each gesture, each familiar expression. There was no sadness in their eyes, only a quiet recognition, as if they were seeing themselves not as prisoners, but as people who had lived, who had loved, who had been happy, even in the midst of sorrow. And in that moment, the notebook became something more than paper and ink. It became a testament, a record of a life that had existed, that had been real, that could not be erased, even if the world forgot. Olga, who had always been the most reflective, began to write more in her diary, not just the events of the day, but her thoughts, her fears, her hopes, her observations of the way light moved across the floor, the way her father's voice softened when he spoke to Alexei, the way her mother's hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. She wrote about the guards, not with hatred, not with fear, but with curiosity, wondering who they were, what they dreamed of, whether they, too, had families waiting for them somewhere, whether they ever looked at the stars and wondered if they were doing the right thing. She did not write for publication. She did not write to be remembered. She wrote because the act of writing made the world feel less heavy, as if putting words to paper could hold back the darkness, if only for a little while. And in those pages, a legacy was being formed, not of power, not of empire, but of witness, of a young woman who saw the world with clear eyes and refused to look away, who chose to remember, even when forgetting would have been easier. Tatiana, ever the caretaker, began to keep a small journal of remedies, of herbs, of ways to ease pain with what little they had. She recorded the times when Alexei's bleeding stopped, the teas that helped him sleep, the way a warm cloth on his legs could bring relief, the hours when he smiled, when he spoke, when he seemed almost like himself again. She did it not with the hope of healing, but with the instinct to care, to do something, anything, to make the unbearable a little lighter, to turn helplessness into action, no matter how small. And in that quiet act of tending, she became a kind of healer, not with medicine, but with presence, with touch, with the certainty that love could not cure, but could comfort, could hold space, could say, without words, "You are not alone." Maria, whose warmth had always been her strength, now became the keeper of joy. She remembered jokes, songs, gains from their childhood, and brought them out like treasures, sharing them not to distract, but to remind. She would hum a tune from a play they had performed in Tobolsk, or recite a poem they had learned as children, her voice soft, her eyes closed, as if returning to a time when the world was still kind, when the future was open, when the only danger was a scraped knee or a lost doll, and when the others joined in, even quietly, even without smiling, she knew she had done something real. She had not changed their fate. She had not brought them freedom. But she had given them a moment where they were not prisoners, but a family, laughing at a memory only they could share. A moment where the past was not a burden, but a gift. Nikolai, watching them, felt a sorrow so deep it bordered on peace. He had failed as a ruler. He had not saved his empire. He had not prevented the war, the revolution, the exile. But he had not failed as a father. He had not failed as a husband. And in the quiet courage of his family, he saw something that no crown could bestow, no history could erase, the legacy of love. It was not written in stone. It was not carried on banners. It was written in the way Alexandra held his hand, in the way the children gathered around the table, in the way they still called him Papa, even now, even here. And in that truth, he found a kind of redemption not for the throne he had lost, but for the life he had lived, not for the power he had held, but for the love he had given and received. Alexandra, too, began to understand that her faith had not been in vain. She had prayed for miracles, for rescue, for a sign. But the miracle had already come. It was not in deliverance. It was in endurance. It was in the way her children still smiled, still loved, still held on. She had spent her life believing that God would protect them through power, through divine right, through the sanctity of the crown. But now she saw that his protection had come in another form, in the quiet strength of a family that refused to break, in the way they cared for one another when no one else would, in the way they remained human, even when the world tried to make them less than that. And in that realization, her prayers changed. They were no longer pleas. They were thanks for each breath, each moment, each hand held in the dark. The guards, too, began to shift, not in their orders, but in their demeanor. Some still remained cold, their faces unreadable, their voices sharp. But others, those who brought the meals, who stood watch at night, began to linger a little longer, to speak a little softer, to avoid meeting their eyes not out of cruelty, but out of shame. One young guard, barely older than Olga, once left a small sprig of wildflowers on the windowsill, gone before anyone could thank him. Another, when asked for more blankets, brought an extra one without being told. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of humanity, small rebellions of the heart against the weight of duty. And in them, the family saw that even in the darkest places, kindness could still grow, that compassion could exist even in the service of cruelty, that the soul could resist, even when the body obeyed. One evening, as the fire dimmed and the room filled with the soft glow of the lamp, Alexei asked his father a question that hung in the air long after it was spoken. "Will anyone remember us?" Nikolai did not answer at once. He looked at his son, at his pale face, at his quiet eyes, and then at the others, gathered close. He thought of the palaces, the ceremonies, the portraits, the history books. And then he thought of the notebook, the diary, the songs, the flowers on the windowsill. "Yes," he said at last, his voice steady, "not for what we were, but for who we are." And in that moment, the legacy was no longer something that would come after. It was already here, in the way they loved, in the way they endured, in the way they remained human, even when the world had tried to make them less. Days passed, the light changed, the seasons turned. And though they did not know it, though no one could tell them, their story had already begun to leave its mark. In Tobolsk, the house where they had lived was still standing, its windows dark, but its walls holding the memory of laughter, of footsteps, of a family who had tried to live in peace. In Petrograd, a servant who had served them for years kept a photograph hidden in a drawer, taking it out only at night, whispering their names like a prayer. And far away, in quiet corners of the world, people would one day speak of them, not as tyrants, not as victims, but as a family who had loved deeply, suffered greatly, and remained together until the end. They did not know they were becoming a story, not in the way legends are born, not in the way history is written. They did not know that their names would one day be spoken in hushed tones, that their faces would appear in books, that their final days would be studied, mourned, remembered. They did not know that the quiet moments they lived, the shared tea, the whispered prayers, the drawings in a hidden notebook, would one day be the very things that made them real to strangers centuries later. But it was happening all the same, not in grand monuments or official records, but in the fragile, enduring power of love that refuses to be forgotten, in the way a single act of kindness can echo through time, in the way a family's courage, lived in silence, can become a light for those who come after. And so, their legacy was not built on thrones or armies, not on decrees or conquests, but on the unbreakable bond of those who love and are loved in return, on the quiet dignity of staying together when the world is turned away, on the decision to remain human, even when humanity has been denied. It was not a legacy of power. It was a legacy of presence. And in the quiet, in the dark, in the heart of the storm, that was not only enough, it was everything. The years that followed did not rush forward, but settled like dust on an old photograph, soft and quiet, blurring the edges of what had been, while preserving the essence of who they were. The world moved on, as it always does, rebuilding itself from the ashes of revolution, forging a new identity from the ruins of the old. But in the stillness between moments, in the pause before sleep, in the hush of a winter evening, in the way a candle flickers before it goes out, the memory of the Romanovs remained, not as a political symbol, not as a warning or a tragedy, but as a whisper carried on the cold air, a presence felt more than seen, like the weight of snow on a branch before it falls. There were no monuments raised in their name, no grand memorials in the early years, for the new order had no place for the past it had overthrown, and so their story slipped beneath the surface of history, not forgotten, but hidden, like a letter buried in the floorboards of a house no one lives in anymore. Yet memory has its own way of surviving. It does not depend on stone or inscription. It lives in the hands of those who remember, in the voice of a grandmother telling her granddaughter about the family who once lived in the palace by the Neva, in the way a priest lights a candle in a quiet church long after the empire has fallen, in the yellowed pages of a diary found in an attic. Its ink faded, but its words still legible. In Tobolsk, the house where they had lived became a place people passed without speaking, their steps slowing as they neared the gate, their eyes lifting to the windows as if expecting to see a face there. Children were told not to play too loudly in the yard, not out of respect for the state, but out of a quiet understanding that some spaces are not empty, even when no one is inside. In Yekaterinburg, the Ipatiev house stood for years, a silent witness to what had taken place within its walls. The guards changed, the city grew, the revolution hardened into policy, but the house remained, its wooden beams darkened by time, its shutters weathered by wind and rain. People avoided it, not out of fear, but out of a sense that the air around it was heavier, that the silence within was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that could not be named. A worker once said he heard laughter one evening as he passed, soft and distant, like children playing behind a closed door. Another claimed he saw a light in the upstairs window, though no one had lived there in decades. These were not stories meant to be believed, but to be felt, small tremors in the fabric of the everyday that reminded people that some lives, even when ended in darkness, do not vanish entirely. The diaries survived. Hidden, passed from hand to hand, smuggled across borders, they emerged years later, their pages fragile, their bindings cracked, but their voices clear. Olga's careful script, Tatiana's gentle observations, Maria's warmth, Anastasia's humor, each word a testament to the fact that they had lived, not as symbols, but as girls who loved their family, who dreamed of simple things, who wrote about the weather, about books, about the way the light fell in the morning. Alekshi's letters, short and full of curiosity, revealed a boy who, despite pain and confinement, never stopped wondering about the world. And Nikolai's final journal, written in the last months, spoke not of bitterness, but of love for his wife, for his children, for the quiet dignity of a life lived with care. These were not the words of rulers. They were the words of people. And in their simplicity, they carried a power no decree ever could. Alexandra's prayer book was found years later in a storage room of a monastery, its pages worn, its edges frayed, the cross inside tarnished but intact. A nun who held it said she felt a deep calm when she touched it, as if the years of devotion had seeped into the leather, as if the countless prayers whispered over it had left a warmth that time could not erase. She did not display it. She did not show it to visitors. She placed it on a shelf in the chapel, where it remained unseen but present, like a quiet act of remembrance that asked for nothing but to exist. As decades passed, the Soviet Union rose and fell, and with its collapse, the silence around the Romanovs began to lift. The truth, long buried, began to surface not in propaganda, but in science, in bone, in DNA. In a forest outside Yekaterinburg, a mass grave was discovered, its contents carefully examined, its story pieced together from fragments. The remains of Nikolai, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Alexei were identified, not by crowns or uniforms, but by the shape of their bones, by the traces of hemophilia in the boy's skeleton, by the small details that only family could know. And when the news was confirmed, it did not spark outrage or celebration. It sparked mourning, a quiet, collective grief for a family that had not been seen in life for who they truly were, but was finally recognized in death. They were reburied in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, not with the fanfare of an imperial funeral, but with the solemnity of a homecoming. The city that had turned away from them now opened its arms, not to the Tsar, but to the man, the woman, the children who had suffered and loved and endured. The bells rang, not for power, but for peace. The streets were not filled with crowds, but with silence, as if the city itself were holding its breath. And when the coffins were lowered, when the final prayers were said, when the last candle was extinguished, There was a sense that something had been restored, not the empire, not the throne, but a simple human truth. That they had been here, that they had mattered, that they were not forgotten. In the years that followed, their story began to take shape in new ways. Not in the myths of Anastasia's survival, though those tales still lingered like old songs, but in books, in films, in quiet exhibitions where their photographs were displayed not as royalty, but as people. A child's drawing, a letter, a pair of tiny boots, these were the things that moved visitors, not the jewels or the palaces. Parents brought their children to see them, not to teach history, but to speak of love, of loss, of the fragility of life. And in those moments, the Romanovs ceased to be figures of the past and became part of the present, not as ghosts, but as reminders. A school in Tobolsk placed a small plaque by the garden where the children had once played, not with grand words, but with a simple line. Here, they were happy. A woman in England, decades later, claimed to be Anastasia, but when asked why she had never spoken before, she could not name the dog they had loved, could not describe the color of the curtains in their room. And so, the world let the story go, not because it lacked romance, but because the truth that they had died together, that they had not escaped, that their love had not saved them from death, but had sustained them until the end, was more beautiful than any fiction. In the quiet corners of Russia, in villages far from the capital, old women still light candles on certain nights, not for saints, but for the family who once ruled, not out of loyalty to the crown, but out of pity, of compassion, of the deep human instinct to mourn those who suffered. They do not pray for their return. They pray for their rest. And in that act, the legacy of the Romanovs is not in the empire they lost, but in the empathy they awakened, in the way their story, stripped of power and spectacle, became a mirror for the quiet tragedies that live in every family, in every heart. Even now, if you walk through the Winter Palace on a winter evening, when the last visitors have left and the guards are silent, you might feel a change in the air, not cold, not fear, but presence, a softness, a stillness that feels like listening. The floors creak, not from age, but as if someone has just passed. A door closes gently, though no wind blows. And if you stand in the nursery, where the children once slept, you might hear, faintly, the sound of laughter brief, tender, gone before you can be sure it was real. These are not hauntings. They are echoes, not of power, but of life, of a family who lived, who loved, who were broken, but who were never erased. The world tried to forget them. Time tried to bury them. But memory has its own rhythm, slow and deep, like the turning of the earth. It does not shout. It waits. It gathers. And in the end, it preserves not the grandest deeds, but the smallest truths, the way a mother strokes her child's hair, the way a father holds his son's hand, the way four sisters huddle together when the night grows cold. These are the things that survive, not because they were written in history books, but because they were lived in silence, in dignity, in love. And so, the Romanovs are not gone. They are not lost. They are not only bones in a cathedral, or names in a book. They are in the quiet moments when someone chooses kindness over fear, when a family stays together though the world turns away, when a candle is lit not for glory, but for remembrance. They are in the way we speak of them now, not with awe, but with tenderness, not as rulers, but as people who remind us that even in the darkest times, even in the face of the unthinkable, love can remain unbroken. The snow still falls over Yekaterinburg. The Neva still flows beneath the bridges of St. Petersburg. The stars still blink above the forests of Siberia. And somewhere, in the space between breath and dream, a child laughs, a mother hums a lullaby, a father reads a story by candlelight. Time does not erase. It gathers. It holds. And in its quiet embrace, the past does not end. It simply becomes part of the night, part of the stillness, part of the endless, gentle whisper of those who are loved, and who, in being remembered, are never truly gone. There is a kind of quiet that only comes at night, when the world has finally settled into stillness, and the air itself seems to pause between breaths, when the mind begins to drift, and the heart listens more than it thinks. It is in this quiet that the past does not disappear, but draws closer, not as a loud voice, but as a whisper carried on the edge of sleep, a presence felt in the soft weight of a blanket, in the slow rhythm of breath, in the way a memory surfaces without being called. The story of the Romanovs does not end in the basement of the Ipatiev house, not truly, because endings are never as final as we believe. What ends is the chapter, but what remains, what lingers in the silence, in the spaces between heartbeats, is something deeper, something that cannot be buried or forgotten, something that lives not in history books, but in the way we remember those who loved deeply, suffered greatly, and stayed together until the end. If you walk through St. Petersburg today, when the snow falls gently over the Neva, and the gas lamps glow like drowned stars beneath a veil of frost, you might feel a change in the air, not cold, not fear, but presence. Not the presence of power, not the weight of empire, but the quiet hum of a family who once lived within those palaces, who walked those halls, who looked out over that river with the same wonder you might feel now. The Winter Palace still stands, its golden domes dusted with snow, its windows reflecting the city's light, but it no longer holds a throne. It holds something else, a memory, a breath, a story told not in grand halls, but in the small rooms where children played, where a mother prayed, where a father read to his son. And if you close your eyes and listen, you might hear, beneath the footsteps of tourists and the murmur of guides, the faint echo of laughter, soft and distant, like a song half remembered from childhood. In Yekaterinburg, the church on the blood now rises where the Ipatiev house once stood, its golden domes reaching toward the sky like hands in prayer. It is not a monument to vengeance, nor to the fall of an empire, but to remembrance, to the quiet dignity of those who suffered. People come not to glorify, but to mourn, to light candles, to leave flowers, to stand in silence as if honoring not royalty, but humanity. The names of Nikolai, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei are not spoken with awe, but with tenderness, as if they were not rulers, but neighbors, family, souls who endured what few could imagine and did not break. And in that act of remembrance, their legacy is not in the crown they lost, but in the love they kept, in the way they remained together when the world turned away. Even now, in homes far from Russia, in cities where the snow never falls, people speak of them, not as tyrants, not as victims, but as a family. A mother reads their story to her children before bed, not to frighten, but to teach about courage, about love, about the quiet strength of staying true when everything is taken. A student writes a paper not on the revolution, but on the diaries of the Grand Duchesses, on the way they dreamed of simple lives, of gardens, of music, of peace. An artist paints not their coronations, but their final days, not with horror, but with dignity, capturing the way Alexandra held her son's hand, the way Nikolai looked at his family as if memorizing them. These are not acts of nostalgia. They are acts of connection, of a world slowly learning that history is not only written in battles and decrees, but in the quiet moments between heartbeats. The world tried to erase them. Time tried to bury them. But memory has its own way of surviving, not in stone, not in power, but in the fragile, enduring power of love. A photograph found in an attic, its edges worn, the faces faded, but still smiling. A diary page yellowed with age, the ink barely legible, but the words still clear. Today, we played cards. Alexei laughed. A child's drawing of a dog, labeled Joy, the same dog who followed them through the gardens of Tobolsk. These are not relics. They are proof. Proof that they lived. Proof that they loved. Proof that even in darkness, even in confinement, even in the face of the unthinkable, they chose kindness, presence, togetherness. And so, their story continues, not as a warning, not as a tragedy, but as a whisper that still moves through the world, carried on the breath of those who remember. It lives in the way a parent holds a sick child a little longer, in the way a family gathers at the table, even when the news is bad, in the way people choose to love when it would be easier to turn away. It lives in the quiet courage of staying human, even when the world demands otherwise. It lives in the way we speak of them now, not with judgment, but with compassion, not as symbols, but as people who remind us that no life is too small to matter, no love too fragile to endure. If you have ever sat with someone you love in silence, not needing to speak, just being there, you have touched their legacy. If you have ever chosen kindness over anger, presence over escape, love over fear, you have carried their story forward. It is not in grand gestures, but in the thousand small ways we care for one another when no one is watching, when no one is recording, when the world has turned its back. The Romanovs did not change the course of history with armies or decrees. They changed it with the way they lived their final days, with dignity, with tenderness, with the unbreakable bond of a family who refused to let go. And so, their echo is not in the sound of gunfire or the fall of a throne, but in the soft breath of a child falling asleep, in the rustle of a blanket, in the way a candle flickers before it goes out. It is in the way we remember them not for what they were, but for who they were, a father who loved his children, a mother who prayed without ceasing, daughters who laughed in the dark, a son who dreamed of the sea. These are not the deeds of emperors. They are the truths of human beings. And in that truth, their story becomes not something distant, but something close, not something past, but something present, not something lost, but something found in the quiet of our own hearts. You may never have walked through the Winter Palace. You may never have seen the Neva in winter. You may never have held one of their letters in your hands. But you have felt what they felt, the weight of love, the ache of fear, the need to believe that someone is still listening. And in that feeling, you are not separate from them. You are part of the same story, the same long thread of human experience that stretches across centuries, connecting us not through power, but through emotion, not through conquest, but through compassion. The world moves fast now. It speaks loudly. It demands attention. But here, in this moment, in the space between one breath and the next, there is a different rhythm, a slower one, the rhythm of memory, of reflection, of rest. And in that rhythm, the Romanovs are not gone. They are not lost. They are not only bones in a cathedral or names in a book. They are in the way we choose to remember, in the way we choose to care, in the way we choose to love, even when we know it may not save us, but we do it anyway. Time does not erase. It gathers, it holds. It returns to us what we thought was gone, not in the form we expect, but in the form we need. A scent, a song, a feeling, a dream. And in that return, we understand that nothing truly disappears. The snow falls over Yekaterinburg. The stars blink above the forests of Siberia. The Neva flows beneath the bridges of St. Petersburg. And somewhere, in the space between breath and dream, a mother hums a lullaby. A father reads a story. A child laughs, brief and tender, gone before you can be sure it was real. These are not hauntings. They are echoes. And echoes, no matter how faint, are still sound. They are still life. They are still love. You do not need to believe in ghosts to feel them. You only need to be still, to listen, to remember that every life, no matter how ended, leaves a mark, not always in the world, but in the hearts of those who come after. The Romanovs are not remembered for their crown. They are remembered for their humanity. And in that remembrance, they live on, not as rulers, but as a family who teaches us, across time, how to love, how to endure, how to stay together until the end. And so, as you lie here, warm beneath your blanket, your breath slow, your body sinking into stillness, know that you are not alone. You are part of a long line of stories, of lives, of loves, of losses. You are part of the same quiet that holds the past and welcomes the future. You are part of the echo. And in that echo, there is no fear. There is no sorrow. There is only the soft, steady truth that love, once given, never truly ends. Let that truth settle over you now, like snow falling without hurry, like a hand resting gently on your shoulder, like a voice that says, without words, you are not forgotten. Let it carry you deeper into rest, into peace, into the dream where all stories blend, where the past and present meet, where a family once lost is simply a family remembered, not for their fall, but for their love. They are not here to frighten you. They are here to comfort you. They are here to remind you that even in the darkest times, even in the face of the unknown, we are never truly alone. We are held by those who came before, by those who loved, by those who stayed, by those who in the end chose each other. And so, as sleep gathers around you, as the world fades and the mind begins to drift, let their whisper be the last thing you hear, a soft breath, a gentle sigh, a story not of endings, but of presence, of love, of a family who, in their final days, became eternal not by power, but by the quiet courage of simply being together. Let that be the dream you carry into the night. Let that be the peace you rest in, and know, wherever you are, whatever you carry, that you, too, are remembered. And that is enough. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of this quiet journey through the final days of the Romanovs, not with a loud farewell, but with a soft breath, like the last note of a lullaby fading into the hush of night, like snow settling on a rooftop without a sound. The story does not end here, not truly, for stories like this one do not vanish with the last word, but slip into the spaces between heartbeats, into the stillness that follows a long exhale, into the warmth of a blanket pulled a little higher, into the slow drift toward dreams where time no longer matters, and the past walks beside us like a quiet companion. You have traveled far tonight, not across miles, but across decades, across silence, across the fragile boundary between history and memory, and you have done so not with effort, but with presence, with openness, with the gentle courage it takes to listen deeply. I thank you for being here, for choosing this moment, for allowing the world outside to soften and fade while you stepped into a story that asked not for your attention, but for your stillness. These moments where we pause, where we remember, where we simply rest in the presence of another's life, are rare, and they are sacred in their own quiet way. They do not demand grand gestures. They only ask that someone be willing to listen, to feel, to hold space for what was, for what could have been, for what remains. And in that act, something ancient is kept alive. Not the empire, not the throne, not the crown, but the simple, enduring truth of a family who loved, who suffered, who stayed together until the very end. Wherever you are tonight, beneath whatever sky, in whatever room wrapped in whatever quiet, know that you are not separate from this story. The same stars that watched over St. Petersburg and Tobolsk now blink above you. The same need to love and be loved moves through your heart as it did through theirs. The same breath that once filled Alexandra's lungs as she whispered a prayer now fills yours as you prepare to rest. We are not so far apart across time as we might believe. We are connected not by power or legacy, but by the fragile, unbreakable thread of being human, of hoping, of fearing, of holding on when everything feels like it might slip away. Let your breath slow now, as if the air itself has grown heavier with peace, as if each inhale carries the cool clarity of a winter night, and each exhale releases the weight of the day like smoke dissolving into the dark. Let your body sink deeper into stillness, not with effort, but with surrender, like a leaf settling onto still water, like a candle flame bowing before it goes out. There is nothing more to do, nothing more to carry, nothing left to prove. Just this moment, just this warmth, just the softness beneath you and the silence around you, gathering like a familiar friend. If you'd like, before sleep takes you, you can leave a word, your name, the city where you are, the thought that lingers in your mind, just to say, I was here. You don't need to speak it aloud. You don't need to write it down. Just hold it gently in your heart, like a stone warmed by your palm, and know that in that small act, you are part of something larger. You are not just a listener. You are a keeper of memory. And stories like this one survive not in books or monuments, but in moments like this, when someone, somewhere, chooses to remember, to feel, to be present. This is not goodbye, but a quiet pause, a breath suspended in kindness, like the hush between two heartbeats or the softest moment when snow meets earth without a sound. It is the continuation of a story, not in words, but in feeling a story that moved from one quiet heart to another, carried in the stillness that follows the last sentence, in the warmth that lingers after the voice has faded, in the peace that gently settles over you now, as real and tender as a hand resting on your shoulder in the dark. Whenever you're ready, there will be another night, another story, another journey through time. But for now, let go. Let your thoughts soften like embers cooling in a stove. Let your body release every weight it has carried and simply be here, now, safe, warm, and not alone, as the dreams gather around you and carry you gently into the long, quiet night.